Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Project Hypnos. Here I share real stories of unexplained encounters, sightings, disappearances, and strange lights in the sky to help you unwind, relax, and drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop it in the comments if you would. Now, find a comfortable place to rest. Dim the lights, let the noise of the day fade away, and get ready for another set of encounters from the edge of what we understand. The trail we were following wasn't on any official map. My hiking partner, Jake, had found it mentioned in a forum post from someone who claimed to have discovered abandoned infrastructure from the Cold War era, hidden deep in the Olympic National Forest. As amateur radio enthusiasts, we were both fascinated by the idea of finding old transmission equipment, so we'd planned a 3-day backpacking trip to search for whatever might be out there. The trailhead was about 40 miles west of Port Angeles, at the end of a logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. We'd driven as far as we could in Jake's pickup truck, then loaded our packs and started hiking into terrain that felt increasingly remote with every mile. The forest was thick with Douglas fir and western hemlock, and the understory was dense enough that we could barely see 50 feet in any direction. We'd been hiking for about 6 hours when we found the first sign that we were on the right track, a concrete foundation overgrown with moss and ferns, barely visible beneath decades of forest debris. It was too large and too perfectly square to be natural, clearly the remnant of some kind of structure that had been built and then abandoned years ago. Jake and I spent 20 minutes clearing away the vegetation, revealing what looked like anchor points for guy wires and the remains of a grounding system. Definitely radio equipment, Jake said, examining the corroded metal fittings embedded in the concrete. Big stuff, too. We followed a barely visible path leading away from the foundation, marked by the occasional piece of rusted cable or ceramic insulator hanging from tree branches. The trail wound uphill through increasingly steep terrain, and after another 2 hours of climbing, we reached a ridge that offered our first clear view of the surrounding landscape. That's when we saw the tower. It was about half a mile away, rising from a small clearing on an adjacent ridge. From our vantage point, it looked like a standard radio tower, maybe 200 feet tall, lattice construction, with what appeared to be several antenna arrays mounted at different levels. What struck us immediately was how well maintained it looked. The metal appeared to be in good condition, with no obvious rust or structural damage, and the guy wires were taut and properly tensioned. That's strange, I said, studying the tower through binoculars. Jake was checking his GPS unit, trying to correlate our position with the topographic maps we'd brought. According to this, there's nothing here. No roads, no structures, nothing. We decided to make camp where we were and approach the tower in the morning when we'd have better light and more energy. As we set up our tents, we could see a faint red light blinking at the top of the tower, the standard aircraft warning beacon that all tall structures are required to have. The fact that it was operating suggested that the tower was still active, still connected to some kind of power source. After dinner, Jake pulled out his portable radio scanner and started cycling through frequencies, listening for any transmissions that might be coming from the tower. For the first hour, we heard nothing but the usual mix of commercial broadcasts, aviation communications, and amateur radio chatter. But around 10 o'clock, Jake stopped scanning and held up his hand for silence. "Listen to this," he said, adjusting the volume. The signal was strong and clear, coming from somewhere in the high-frequency range. It was a human voice, male, middle-aged, speaking in a calm, measured tone that suggested he was reading from prepared text. But the content of the transmission was unlike anything either of us had heard before. Temperature readings remained stable at -7 degrees Celsius, 92 inches, and falling slowly. Wind speed is 8 knots from the northwest. Solar radiation levels are within normal parameters. Time is 20:200 hours, Pacific Standard Time. The voice stopped, and the frequency went silent. Jake and I looked at each other, both of us thinking the same thing. "Weather reports," I said. Jake added, "This frequency isn't monitored by the National Weather Service. It's not on any of the standard emergency bands." We stayed up until midnight, listening for the next transmission. At exactly 11 p.m., the same voice returned with another weather report, delivered in the same calm, professional tone. The data was precise and detailed, covering atmospheric conditions, temperature variations at different altitudes, and solar activity levels. It sounded like the kind of information you might hear from a research station in Antarctica or a remote military installation. The next morning, we broke camp early and hiked toward the tower. The terrain was more difficult than it had appeared from a distance, and it took us 3 hours to cover the half-mile of ridges and valleys that separated us from our destination. When we finally reached the clearing where the tower stood, we found something that didn't match what we'd observed from afar. The tower itself was exactly as it had appeared through binoculars, tall, well-maintained, and obviously functional. But the support buildings at its base were in a state of decay that suggested they'd been abandoned for decades. There were 3 concrete block structures arranged around the base of the tower, all with their roofs partially collapsed and their walls crumbling from years of exposure to the elements. Jake and I approached the buildings cautiously, unsure whether we might encounter security systems or caretakers. But the place felt deserted, with that particular quality of emptiness that comes with long abandonment. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete, and the doorways were blocked by debris that had accumulated over many seasons. The largest building appeared to have housed the main transmitting equipment. Through a broken window, we could see racks of electronic gear covered in dust and debris, their metal cases corroded and their connections long since failed. It was clearly non-functional, the kind of vintage equipment that might have been state-of-the-art in the 1960s, but had been obsolete for decades. But the tower itself was definitely active. We could hear a faint humming sound coming from the base, where heavy cables disappeared into a concrete vault that was sealed with a steel cover we couldn't remove. Every hour, we could hear the click of relays engaging, followed by the brief burst of radio transmission that we'd been monitoring the night before. Jake wondered aloud. There are no electrical lines out here, no generators that I can see. We spent the rest of the day exploring the area around the tower, looking for clues about its purpose and operation. We found the remains of what might have been living quarters, a small building that had once contained bunks and a kitchen. There was also a structure that looked like it had been used for vehicle maintenance, with a concrete floor stained by decades-old oil spills. Most intriguingly, we discovered a partially buried cable that led away from the tower site toward the deeper forest. The cable was modern, much newer than the abandoned buildings, and it disappeared into a conduit that had been carefully camouflaged with natural materials. Jake and I followed it for about a quarter mile before losing the trail in dense underbrush. That evening, we camped in the clearing next to the tower, listening to the hourly weather broadcasts and trying to piece together what we'd found. The transmissions continued like clockwork, precise, professional, and utterly pointless as far as we could determine. No one responded to the broadcasts, no other stations acknowledged them, and the frequency remained silent except for those brief, hourly reports. Around midnight, something changed. Instead of the usual weather data, the voice began transmitting what sounded like a series of numbers and letters, coordinates, radio frequencies, and coded references that meant nothing to us. The transmission lasted for nearly 10 minutes, much longer than the usual weather reports, and it was followed by a period of silence that stretched past the normal 1-hour interval. When the voice returned, it was different. The tone was more urgent, less controlled, and the content had shifted from scientific data to what sounded like personal observations. Day 847 of the monitoring protocol, the voice said. No contact from base station in 72 hours. Equipment is functioning within normal parameters, but I'm beginning to question the purpose of continued transmission. 230 megahertz. Jake and I exchanged glances. This wasn't a recording or an automated system. It was a live person broadcasting from somewhere nearby, apparently unaware that anyone was listening. But where was he? We'd explored the entire area around the tower, and there was no evidence of current human habitation. The next morning, we made a more systematic search of the area, looking for any structure we might have missed. About a quarter mile from the tower, following the buried cable we'd discovered, we found something that shouldn't have been there, a small building that hadn't been visible from any of our previous vantage points. It was built into the side of a hill and covered with vegetation so that it blended perfectly with the natural landscape. The building had a single steel door with no windows, and it was clearly much newer than the abandoned structures around the tower. When we approached it, we could hear the faint sound of electrical equipment running inside. Ventilation fans, maybe computers, the subtle hum of modern electronics. Jake knocked on the door, and the sounds inside immediately stopped. We waited for several minutes, but no one answered. When Jake knocked again, a voice called out from inside, the same voice we'd been hearing on the radio. The voice asked, "This is a restricted facility." "We're hikers," Jake called back. "We got lost and we're just trying to find our way back to the trail." There was a long pause before the voice responded. "That's impossible. No one comes out here." "We hiked in from the logging road about 10 miles east of here," I said. "We're amateur radio operators, and we were interested in the old tower." Another long pause. Then we heard the sound of multiple locks being disengaged, and the door opened just wide enough to reveal a man in his 50s with a graying beard and clothing that looked like it hadn't been changed in weeks. His eyes were wide and slightly unfocused, like someone who hadn't seen another human being in a very long time. "You can't be here," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "This is a classified monitoring station," Jake asked gently. The man's expression became confused, almost lost. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "I've been sending the same data for over 2 years now. Temperature, pressure, atmospheric conditions. But no one ever responds. No one ever acknowledges the transmissions." He told us his name was Dr. Richard Morse, and that he was a meteorologist who had been assigned to this remote station as part of what he'd been told was a long-term atmospheric research project. He'd been living alone in the underground facility, following protocols that required him to broadcast weather data every hour and to maintain strict communication security. "But it's been 2 years," he said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. 2 years of the same routine, and I haven't had any contact with my supervisors since the first month. The supply drops stopped coming. The radio checks stopped happening." Jake and I spent the next hour talking with Dr. Morse, trying to understand his situation. It became clear that he was in serious psychological distress, isolated for so long that he'd begun to lose track of time and purpose. He showed us his living quarters, a small, cramped space filled with monitoring equipment and supplies that were clearly running low. We convinced him to come with us when we hiked out, promising to help him contact his superiors and get the answers he deserved. But when we reached the trailhead and Dr. Morse tried to call the phone numbers he'd been given, every one of them was disconnected. The organization that had stationed him at the tower seemed to have vanished, leaving him to continue his pointless broadcasts to an empty sky. It took weeks of investigation, but we eventually learned that Dr. Morse had been the victim of an elaborate psychological experiment conducted by a private research company that had since been dissolved and its principals thus scattered to other ventures. He'd been told he was participating in legitimate atmospheric research, but in reality, he was being studied to determine how long an isolated individual could maintain routine tasks without external validation or contact. Dr. Morse is doing better now. He's receiving treatment for the psychological trauma of his isolation, and he's found work with a legitimate weather monitoring organization. But sometimes, when I'm scanning the radio frequencies late at night, I think about that tower standing alone in the Olympic forest, still broadcasting its hourly weather reports to no one, still following protocols that were designed not to gather data, but to study the limits of human endurance. The experience changed how I think about the remote places in our world, the forgotten installations and abandoned projects that dot the landscape like scars from experiments we'd rather not remember. How many other Dr. Morses are out there, following orders that no longer have meaning, broadcasting to audiences that no longer exist, waiting for contact that will never come? The tower is still there, is still active. Jake and I reported its location to the authorities, but bureaucratic inertia means it will probably keep transmitting for years before anyone bothers to shut it down. And somewhere in the static between the stations, Dr. Morse's voice still echoes, reading weather data to the empty air, a ghost frequency carrying the message of a man who was forgotten by the people who sent him into the wilderness to wait. I discovered it while scrolling through my photos on a Sunday morning, looking for a picture I'd taken of my niece's birthday cake the day before. The photo appeared between two images I remembered clearly, one of the cake with its 7 candles, another of my sister laughing as she helped blow them out. But there, nestled chronologically between those familiar moments, was a photograph I had never taken, which showed me sleeping. The image was taken from the foot of my bed, looking down at my sleeping form. I was lying on my side, one arm tucked under the pillow, my face peaceful in the way it only is during deep sleep. The lighting was soft, natural, as if taken during the early morning hours when dawn light first begins to filter through bedroom curtains. The angle was slightly elevated, as if the photographer had been standing on something or holding the camera above their head. What disturbed me most wasn't just that someone had apparently entered my bedroom and photographed me without my knowledge, but that the image was stored in my phone's camera roll with a timestamp from 4:17 a.m. that very morning. According to the metadata, I had taken this picture myself, using my own phone, while I was unconscious. I live alone in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building in downtown Portland. The front door has 2 deadbolts and a chain, and I'm meticulous about locking them every night before bed. The fire escape outside my bedroom window is accessible, but the window itself has been painted shut for years, and I would have heard anyone trying to force it open. There was no evidence of forced entry, no signs that anyone had been in my apartment except me. I examined the photo more carefully, zooming in on details that might provide clues about how it had been taken. My bedroom was exactly as I remembered leaving it. Clothes draped over the chair in the corner, books stacked on the nightstand, the water glass I always kept within reach sitting in its usual spot. Nothing appeared to have been moved or disturbed. Even my phone, which should have been charging on the nightstand where I always left it, was visible in the image, plugged into the wall exactly where I expected it to be. But if my phone was on the nightstand charging, how could it have simultaneously been used to take a photograph from the foot of the bed? I checked the other photos in my camera roll, looking for any evidence of sleepwalking or unconscious activity, but the images before and after the mysterious bedroom shot were all normal. Pictures from my niece's party, a sunset I'd photographed on my evening walk, a recipe I'd captured from a cookbook. There was no sequence of bizarre middle-of-the-night photography, no other images that I couldn't remember taking. I called my sister, thinking perhaps I had mentioned sleepwalking or strange dreams during the birthday party, but she said I had seemed perfectly normal, tired perhaps, but coherent and present throughout the evening. When I described the photograph, trying to make it sound less alarming than it felt, she suggested I might have taken it accidentally, maybe while fumbling for my phone during the night. But I knew that explanation didn't make sense. The photo was too well composed, too deliberately framed to be an accident. Someone had stood at the foot of my bed, positioned the camera carefully, and taken a clear, focused image of me sleeping. The question was whether that someone had been me, acting in some unconscious state I couldn't remember, or whether it had been someone else entirely. I installed a motion-activated camera in my bedroom that night, positioning it to cover the area around my bed. If I was sleepwalking or engaging in activities I couldn't remember, I would have evidence. If someone else was entering my apartment, I would catch them in the act. I went to bed feeling somewhat reassured, though I found it difficult to fall asleep, knowing that I was being recorded. The next morning, I checked the camera footage eagerly. The recording showed me going to bed at my usual time, lying in the same position I'd seen in the mysterious photograph. But around 4:15 a.m., something strange happened. The camera's view suddenly shifted, as if it had been moved or turned, and for several minutes it recorded only the ceiling. When the view returned to normal, I was still sleeping peacefully, and my phone was still charging on the nightstand. But when I checked my camera roll, there was another photograph. This one showed me from a different angle, taken from the side of the bed, capturing my profile against the pillow. The timestamp read 4:16 a.m., during the exact period when my security camera had mysteriously pointed toward the ceiling. I reviewed the security footage frame by frame, looking for any sign of movement or disturbance during the time the camera had been redirected, but there was nothing. No shadows crossing the lens, no indication that anyone had physically moved the device. It simply pointed upward for exactly 4 minutes, then returned to its original position, as if it had been programmed to look away during a specific window of time. Over the following weeks, the phenomenon continued with disturbing regularity. Every few nights, I would wake to find a new photograph of myself sleeping, each taken from a different position around my bed. The security camera would invariably malfunction during the exact moments when these pictures were being taken, always looking away or shutting off completely before resuming normal operation. I tried multiple cameras, different brands and models, even professional-grade security equipment borrowed from a friend who worked in private investigation. But every device I installed would experience the same mysterious malfunction, creating gaps in the recording that corresponded precisely with the appearance of new photographs in my camera roll. The pictures themselves became increasingly unsettling. While the first few had been taken from obvious positions around the bed, later images seemed to come from impossible angles, directly above me, as if taken from the ceiling or from beneath the bed looking upward. Some showed extreme close-ups of my face, so detailed I could see individual eyelashes, while others captured wide shots that included parts of the room that should have been outside the frame based on the apparent camera position. I consulted a sleep specialist, hoping to determine if I might be experiencing some form of parasomnia that could explain the nocturnal photography. The doctor conducted tests, monitored my sleep patterns, and reviewed my medical history, but found nothing unusual. My sleep cycles were normal. I showed no signs of sleepwalking or other unconscious behaviors, and I had no history of psychological conditions that might cause dissociative episodes. The doctor did note one curious finding. During the nights when the mysterious photographs appeared, my sleep was unusually deep and undisturbed. The brain waves recorded during those periods showed a level of rest that was almost unnaturally profound, as if something was ensuring that I would not wake up during the photography sessions. I began staying with friends and family members, thinking that changing locations might break whatever pattern was causing the phenomenon. But the photographs followed me wherever I went. A picture of me sleeping on my sister's couch, taken from her coffee table. An image of me in my parents' guest room, shot from the doorway. Even a photograph of me napping in my car during a lunch break, captured from outside the passenger window. Each image appeared in my phone's camera roll, with perfect clarity and appropriate timestamps, and each was accompanied by the same mysterious failure of any recording equipment I had set up to monitor my surroundings. Whatever was taking these pictures had developed an uncanny ability to avoid detection while documenting my most vulnerable moments. I started keeping my phone in a locked drawer before going to sleep, then progressed to leaving it in my car, then eventually storing it in a safe deposit box at the bank. But the photographs continued to appear, somehow transferred to my device, despite its physical absence from my sleeping area. The images now came with no metadata, no timestamp, no digital fingerprint that might explain how they had been captured or transmitted. The most disturbing discovery came when I decided to have the photographs analyzed by a digital forensics expert. She examined the images for signs of manipulation, looked for evidence of compositing or artificial generation, and analyzed every pixel for anomalies that might explain their origin. Her findings were both reassuring and terrifying. The photographs were completely authentic, showing no signs of digital manipulation or artificial creation. But according to her analysis, they hadn't been taken with my phone or any conventional camera. The image quality, compression artifacts, and digital signatures were unlike anything in her extensive database of camera and phone models. It's as if these pictures were created by something that understands photography perfectly, but doesn't use the same technology we do, she told me. The images are real, but they weren't captured by any device I can identify. I stopped trying to solve the mystery after that. The photographs continue to appear, roughly once or twice a week, showing me in various states of sleep across different locations and circumstances. I've learned to live with the knowledge that something, whether it's a part of my own unconscious mind or some external presence I can't comprehend, is documenting my rest with meticulous care and inexplicable method. The images have become a strange comfort in their consistency. They're never threatening or invasive beyond the basic violation of being photographed without consent. Instead, they seem almost protective, as if whatever is taking them wants to preserve moments of peace and vulnerability that I would otherwise never see. Sometimes I look through the collection, scrolling through months of sleep-in photographs, like a bizarre family album. In them, I see myself at my most unguarded, free from the tensions and anxieties that mark my waking hours. The person in those pictures looks more peaceful than I feel most days, and I've begun to wonder if the photographs are less about surveillance than they are about showing me something I need to see about myself. I keep my phone on the nightstand now, accepting whatever process is responsible for these images. And sometimes, in the moments just before sleep, I wonder who will be watching through the lens tonight, and what they see in my sleeping face that compels them to preserve it forever, in pixels I'll discover come morning. My cousin Jake and I were exploring the abandoned property behind his family's farm in rural Nebraska when we found the barn that wasn't supposed to exist. Jake's grandfather had owned that land for 60 years, and according to family records, the only structures on the property were the main farmhouse, a grain silo, and a small equipment shed. But there it was, maybe half a mile from the nearest road, hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees that had grown up around it like nature was trying to keep it secret. It was August 2022, and we were both home from college for the summer. Jake was studying electrical engineering at Iowa State, and I was working on a computer science degree at UNL. We had decided to spend a weekend mapping the extent of his family's property using GPS units and satellite imagery, partly out of curiosity and partly to help his grandfather with some insurance documentation that required precise boundary surveys. The barn appeared on older aerial photographs dating back to the 1970s, but it wasn't on any recent surveys or property maps. It was as if someone had deliberately omitted it from official records, allowing it to fade from documentation while remaining physically present on the landscape. The structure itself was unremarkable, standard Midwest agricultural construction, maybe 40 feet by 60 feet, with weathered wood siding and a metal roof that had seen better days. What made the barn extraordinary was what we found inside. The interior had been completely gutted and converted into something that looked like a cross between a data center and a radio observatory. Banks of electronic equipment lined the walls: servers, monitoring devices, transmission equipment, and computer systems that appeared to be decades more advanced than anything either of us had encountered in our engineering coursework. Everything was connected by thick bundles of coaxial cable and fiber optic lines that converged on a central hub near the back of the barn. The most striking feature was the satellite dish mounted on the roof, visible through a large opening that had been cut in the ceiling. It was enormous, maybe 20 feet in diameter, and constructed with a precision that suggested military or aerospace applications rather than civilian communications. The dish was pointed at a specific angle toward the southern sky, and it rotated slowly and smoothly on motorized gimbals that allowed it to track whatever satellite it was communicating with. Jake and I spent the first hour just walking through the facility, trying to understand the scope and purpose of what we'd discovered. The equipment was obviously expensive and sophisticated, but much of it was labeled with manufacturer names and model numbers that neither of us recognized. Some devices had no labeling at all, just cryptic alphanumeric codes that might have been internal inventory numbers. What struck us both was how well maintained everything appeared to be. Despite the barn's aged exterior, the interior was clean, climate controlled, and obviously still operational. Indicator lights blinked on various pieces of equipment, cooling fans hummed quietly, and several computer monitors displayed streams of data in formats that looked like nothing we'd ever seen in our computer science classes. We tried to access some of the computer terminals, but they were all password protected or required authentication methods that we couldn't bypass. The screens we could observe showed what appeared to be signal processing displays, spectrograms, frequency analyses, and data streams that suggested the facility was monitoring or intercepting communications from multiple sources simultaneously. Jake noticed that one wall was covered with what looked like a massive circuit diagram, hand-drawn schematics that showed the interconnections between all the equipment in the facility. The diagrams were incredibly detailed and precise, but they depicted circuit architectures that neither of us had encountered in our engineering studies. Some of the components shown in the schematics didn't match any standard electronic symbols we knew. "This looks like someone's been designing custom hardware," Jake said, studying the wall diagrams. I was more interested in the data streams visible on the accessible monitors. The displays showed what appeared to be real-time signal interception from multiple sources, radio communications, satellite transmissions, and data protocols that I couldn't identify. Some of the intercepted signals appeared to be encrypted military communications. Others looked like civilian radio traffic, and a few seemed to be formats that didn't match any standard communication protocols. We spent hours documenting what we could with our phones, taking photos of the equipment, the wall diagrams, and the data displays. But every time we tried to record video of the monitor screens, the cameras would malfunction, either producing corrupted files or simply failing to capture the screen content, despite working perfectly for everything else in the facility. As afternoon turned to evening, we made a discovery that changed our understanding of what we'd found. Behind a rack of servers, Jake discovered a filing cabinet that wasn't locked. Inside were hundreds of documents, technical manuals, installation guides, and what appeared to be operational logs dating back to 1979. The documents revealed that the facility was called Station Echo 7 and was apparently part of a signals intelligence network that monitored communications across a significant portion of the central United States. The operational logs showed that the station had been collecting and analyzing radio traffic, satellite communications, and various electromagnetic signals for over 40 years. But what made the documents truly unsettling was their classification level and originating authority. They bore markings from agencies that we'd never heard of, organizations with names like Deep Signal Analysis Group and Electromagnetic Reconnaissance Division that didn't appear in any public records of government structure. Some of the technical manuals described equipment capabilities that seemed to exceed anything we knew existed in the civilian world. References to quantum signal processing, temporal frequency analysis, and dimensional electromagnetic monitoring suggested technologies that sounded more like science fiction than operational intelligence gathering. One entry from 1987 described intercepting a transmission that appeared to be a conversation between multiple parties, conducted in English, but originating from a point in space where no known satellites or spacecraft were located. Another entry from 1995 documented the reception of what appeared to be radio communications from a source that was simultaneously transmitting from multiple locations hundreds of miles apart. Jake and I copied as many documents as we could, taking photos of the most significant technical specifications and operational logs. But as we prepared to leave the facility, we made a final discovery that convinced us we were in over our heads. In a locked room that we'd managed to open using tools from Jake's truck, we found what appeared to be a communication center with equipment that was actively transmitting. Multiple radio and satellite communication systems were operational, sending streams of data to destinations that weren't identified on any of the control panels. Most unsettling was a wall-mounted display that showed a real-time map of the United States with hundreds of blinking dots scattered across the country. According to the display, our station Echo 7 was just one node in a vast intelligence gathering system that had been operating in secret thus for decades. We left the facility as the sun was setting, both of us overwhelmed by the implications of what we'd discovered. Neither of us slept well that night, and the next morning we spent hours researching the agency names and technical specifications We documented, trying to find some official acknowledgement of the programs described in the documents, but we found nothing. The agencies mentioned in the documents didn't exist in any public records. The technical specifications described capabilities that weren't acknowledged in any civilian or military literature. It was as if we'd discovered evidence of a parallel intelligence infrastructure that operated completely outside public awareness or oversight. 3 days later, Jake called me with news that made our discovery even more disturbing. His grandfather had received a visit from two men claiming to be from the Department of Agriculture, asking detailed questions about the family's knowledge of any unused structures on their property. When Jake's grandfather mentioned the old barn in the Cottonwood Grove, the men had quickly noted the location and left without explanation. We drove back to the site that afternoon, but the barn was gone, not destroyed or demolished, simply gone, as if it had never existed. The Cottonwood Grove was still there, but the clearing where the barn had stood was covered with grass and vegetation that looked like it had been undisturbed for years. There were no signs of construction, no evidence that a building had ever stood there, no traces of the sophisticated electronics facility we'd explored just days earlier. The aerial photographs that had shown the barn in previous decades now showed only trees. The GPS coordinates we'd recorded led to empty forest. Even the photos we'd taken with our phones had been corrupted or deleted from our devices, leaving us with no physical evidence of what we'd discovered. Jake and I never spoke about the incident again after that week. We both understood implicitly that we'd stumbled across something that we weren't supposed to know about, something that powerful organizations were willing to make disappear rather than acknowledge. The network of monitoring stations we'd seen on that map was still out there, still operating, still collecting intelligence that served purposes we couldn't understand. But sometimes, when I'm driving through rural areas and I see isolated farm buildings or structures that seem slightly out of place, I wonder if I'm looking at another node in that hidden network, somewhere in the American countryside, concealed in ordinary barns and sheds. A vast electronic intelligence system continues to monitor communications that the public will never know are being intercepted, searching for signals that originate from sources that officially don't exist. The truth about what's being monitored and why remains hidden behind classification levels that extend beyond any publicly acknowledged intelligence programs. But I know it's out there, listening, recording, and analyzing transmissions that reveal activities and communications that challenge everything we think we know about who's really sharing our world. I was camping alone in the Algodones Dunes near the California-Arizona border, a sprawling desert region known for its massive sand formations and popular with off-road vehicle enthusiasts. I'd driven out there for a 3-day solo trip, setting up camp about 2 miles from the nearest access road, in an area where the dunes stretched unbroken to the horizon in every direction. It was late October, and the desert was experiencing one of those perfect autumn periods when daytime temperatures are comfortable and the nights are clear and cool. I'd spent the afternoon hiking and photographing the dramatic sand formations, enjoying the solitude and the sculptural beauty of dunes that shifted constantly in the wind. By evening, I was settled beside my tent with a camp chair and a good book, watching the sunset paint the sand in shades of gold and orange that seemed to glow from within. Around 8 p.m., just after full darkness had settled over the desert, I noticed movement in the sand about 50 yards from my campsite. At first, I thought it might be a sidewinder rattlesnake or some other desert wildlife creating disturbances as it moved through the loose sand. But as I watched more carefully, I realized that whatever was causing the movement was much larger than any animal that should have been active in the dunes after dark. The disturbance appeared as a long, sinuous line moving beneath the surface of the sand, creating a visible ridge that traveled slowly but steadily across the face of a large dune. The ridge was maybe 3 feet wide and extended for what looked like 30 or 40 feet, suggesting something enormous, moving through the sand like a massive snake or worm. I grabbed my flashlight and walked closer to get a better view of whatever was creating the subsurface movement. The beam illuminated the ridge clearly, showing that sand was being displaced from below by something substantial enough to push up a continuous mound as it traveled. The movement was smooth and controlled, following a deliberate path rather than the random wandering you'd expect from burrowing wildlife. What made the phenomenon truly extraordinary was its duration. The subsurface movement continued for over 40 minutes, with the ridge traveling back and forth across multiple dunes in patterns that seemed purposeful rather than random. Sometimes, the disturbance would disappear for a few minutes, only to reappear on a different dune, suggesting that whatever was causing it could move considerable distances underground. I tried to follow the ridge as it moved, hiking across the sand to keep pace with the disturbance, and trying to understand what could create such sustained underground activity. The sand was loose and deep, making it difficult for me to move quickly, but whatever was beneath the surface seemed to navigate the terrain effortlessly. At one point, the ridge passed within 10 feet of where I was standing, and I could hear sounds associated with the movement, a soft sliding or shifting noise that suggested large amounts of sand being displaced by something solid moving through it. The sound was rhythmic and mechanical, lacking the irregular patterns you'd expect from biological activity. I tried to estimate the size of whatever was creating the disturbance by measuring the width and height of the ridge it produced. Based on the amount of sand being displaced, the object moving beneath the surface had to be at least 6 or 8 feet in diameter and possibly much longer. The consistent speed and smooth movement suggested something that was perfectly adapted to subsurface travel through loose sand. Around 9 p.m., the movement pattern changed dramatically. Instead of the slow, steady progress I'd been observing, the ridge began moving in rapid circles and figure-8 patterns, as if whatever was beneath the sand had become agitated or was responding to some kind of stimulus. The speed increased significantly, with the disturbance racing across the dune faces faster than I could follow on foot. The circular movements continued for about 10 minutes before the ridge suddenly stopped in the center of a large dune about 100 yards from my campsite. For several minutes, there was no movement at all, and I began to think that whatever had been creating the disturbance had either gone deeper underground or had emerged somewhere I couldn't see. Then the sand in the center of the stationary ridge began to shift upward, forming a mound that grew larger and more pronounced over the course of several minutes. It looked like something was rising toward the surface, pushing up increasing amounts of sand as it approached ground level. I watched with growing excitement and apprehension, expecting to finally see whatever had been moving beneath the dunes for the past 40 minutes. But just as the mound reached its peak and looked like it was about to break through the surface, the entire disturbance collapsed inward, creating a depression in the sand where the ridge had been. The depression was perfectly circular, maybe 8 feet in diameter, and appeared to be quite deep based on the shadows created by my flashlight. I walked over to examine it more closely, but by the time I reached the location, the loose sand had already begun filling in the depression, erasing the evidence of whatever had briefly attempted to surface. I spent the rest of the evening scanning the dunes for any resumption of the underground movement, but the desert had returned to its normal quiet state. Whatever had been active beneath the sand for those 40 minutes had apparently departed or gone so deep that it was no longer creating surface disturbances. The next morning, I conducted a systematic search of the area where I'd observed the movements, looking for any physical evidence of what had created the disturbances. I found no tracks, no burrows, no shed skin, or other biological traces that might indicate what type of creature could move through sand with such size and persistence. I did find that the sand in the areas where the ridge had traveled was different from the surrounding dunes. It was more compacted and showed a slightly different grain structure, as if it had been subjected to pressure or heat that had altered its composition. The changes were subtle but noticeable when I compared sand samples from the movement areas with sand from undisturbed sections of the dunes. I researched desert wildlife that might explain what I'd observed, looking for information about large burrowing animals that could create sustained underground movement through sand dunes. But I found no desert species large enough or capable enough to account for the size and duration of the disturbances I'd witnessed. The closest match I could find was descriptions of the Mongolian deathworm, a legendary creature reported to move through sand dunes in the Gobi Desert. But those were folklore accounts without scientific verification, and they described a creature in a completely different geographical region with different ecological conditions. I also researched geological phenomena that might create the appearance of large objects moving beneath sand dunes. Some desert areas experience subsurface water flow that can cause sand movement, and certain types of seismic activity can create traveling disturbances in loose sediment. But none of these explanations accounted for the controlled, purposeful movement patterns I'd observed. The most intriguing possibility I found was research suggesting that some desert areas contain underground cavern systems that can be inhabited by unknown species adapted to subsurface environments. These cryptic ecosystems might support creatures that rarely or never surface, living entirely within networks of caves and tunnels beneath the visible landscape. I've returned to the Algodones dunes several times since that October night, always camping in the same general area and watching for any resumption of the underground movement. But I've never again witnessed anything like the sustained, purposeful disturbances that had tracked across multiple dunes for over 40 minutes. The experience changed how I think about desert environments and what might exist beneath the surfaces we assume are empty and lifeless. The sand dunes that appear to be nothing more than wind-blown geological formations might serve as habitat for creatures that have adapted to completely subsurface existence, emerging only rarely and briefly into the surface world that humans observe and study. Whatever moved beneath the Algodones dunes that night was large, persistent, and clearly capable of navigating complex underground terrain with remarkable skill. It operated according to patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random burrowing behavior, following routes and schedules that served functions I could only observe but never understand. The desert contains mysteries that exist literally beneath our feet, in the spaces between surface observation and deep geological processes. Something travels through the sand beneath some of our most familiar landscapes, following paths that connect underground territories we've never mapped and probably never suspected existed. The ridge that moved across those moonlit dunes was evidence of a hidden ecosystem that operates parallel to, but separate from the surface desert we think we know and understand. My father worked for the Forest Service for 32 years, spending most of his career managing remote stations and fire lookout towers in the mountains of central Idaho. He was a practical man who understood weather patterns, wildlife behavior, and the rhythms of wilderness life better than anyone I knew. That's what made his annual ritual so puzzling, and eventually so unsettling when I finally understood what he'd been preparing for every October 15th since before I was born. Growing up, I knew that October 15th was different in our house, though Dad never explained why. Starting about a week before that date, he would begin what he called preparations, checking emergency supplies, testing flashlights and radios, and making sure our house was equipped with enough food and water to last several days. He would take time off work, secure all the windows and doors, and insist that our family stay inside from sunset until sunrise. "We're being visited tonight," he would tell my mother, my sister, and me as evening approached on October 15th. "Everyone stays in the house. No one looks outside. No one opens doors or windows, no matter what you hear. These are the rules, and they're not negotiable." As a child, I assumed this was some kind of family tradition or game that adults played. Dad would turn off all the lights, disconnect the phone, and have us gather in the living room where we would sit quietly, sometimes playing board games by candlelight or reading books until we fell asleep. But he was always alert, always listening, always positioned where he could monitor the house and make sure we followed his instructions. The rules were simple but absolute. No lights, no sounds that could be heard outside, no looking through windows or opening doors. If we heard voices calling our names, we were to ignore them completely. If we heard knocking or scratching at doors or windows, we were to remain silent and motionless. No matter what sounds came from outside the house, we were never to respond or investigate. By the time I was a teenager, I'd begun to question the October 15th ritual and demand explanations for what seemed like an arbitrary and increasingly inconvenient family tradition. But Dad's response was always the same. Some things require preparation and respect. This is one of them. When you're older and have your own place, you can make your own decisions. But as long as you live in this house, you follow the rules on October 15th. I moved away for college when I was 18, and for several years I was relieved to be free of the mysterious annual lockdown that had defined my childhood Octobers. But I continued to call home on October 15th, and Dad always sounded tense and distracted during those brief conversations, clearly focused on his preparations rather than catching up with his son. When I was 25 and working as a park ranger myself, Dad finally invited me to spend October 15th at the family house with the understanding that I was now old enough to learn what the ritual was actually about. I drove home, expecting to finally get explanations for the behavior that had puzzled me for my entire life. You remember the rules, Dad said as I arrived that afternoon, but tonight I'm going to show you why they matter. You're going to understand what visits us every year and why your mother and I have spent decades preparing for this night. As evening approached, Dad conducted his usual preparations, but this time he explained what each step was designed to accomplish. The disconnected phone prevented them from using electronic communication to confuse or manipulate us. The secured windows and doors weren't just about keeping things out. They were about ensuring that we couldn't be tempted to let anything in. The emergency supplies were because October 15th sometimes lasted longer than a single night, depending on their interest in our particular location. Who are they? I asked as Dad positioned himself at a window where he could observe the yard without being seen from outside. I don't know what they are, he replied. I call them visitors because they come every year like clockwork, but they're not human and they're not from anywhere we understand. They're interested in houses, families, routines. They study us, test us, try to interact with us in ways that suggest intelligence, but not benevolence. As full darkness settled over our rural property, Dad explained that the visitors had been coming to our house since 1987, the year he'd bought the property and started working at the nearby forest station. They appeared to be drawn to homes in remote areas, particularly those occupied by people who worked in wilderness management and had regular contact with deep forest environments. The first time it happened, I thought it was just people trespassing or maybe playing pranks, Dad said. But their behavior is too systematic, too purposeful. They know things about our family that strangers couldn't know. They use our voices, our mannerisms, even our memories in ways that suggest they've been watching us for a long time. Around 10 p.m., the visitors arrived. I heard them before I saw them, voices in the yard calling our names with perfect accuracy of tone and inflection. Dad's voice called to Mom from the direction of his workshop, asking her to come help with something urgent. Mom's voice called to me from near the garden, using the same affectionate nickname she'd used when I was a child. My own voice called to my sister from various locations around the house, suggesting different activities and conversations. But all of us were sitting together in the darkened living room, listening to perfect imitations of ourselves calling from outside the house. The voices weren't just mimicking our speech patterns. They were using specific phrases, inside jokes, and emotional tones that suggested intimate knowledge of our family dynamics and history. Through the window, Dad showed me shadows moving across the yard with movements that seemed too fluid and coordinated to be human. The figures were roughly human-sized, but moved with a gliding motion that suggested they weren't bound by normal physical limitations. Sometimes they appeared to be walking upright, Sometimes they seem to flow across the ground like liquid shadows. Don't try to count them, Dad warned as I watched the shapes moving through our yard. There are never the same number twice, and trying to track individual visitors can make you feel disoriented and confused. Just observe generally and remember that nothing they do should be trusted or responded to. The visitors continued their activities for hours, occasionally approaching the house to test doors and windows, sometimes gathering in groups to conduct what looked like discussions or planning sessions. Their interest in our home seemed methodical and scientific, as if they were conducting regular observations of our behavior and reactions to their presence. Most unsettling were the attempts at communication. The visitors would call to us using the voices of relatives who lived far away, friends from work, and even people from our past who they shouldn't have known about. They seemed to have access to our memories and relationships in ways that suggested surveillance extending far beyond the annual visits. Around 3 a.m., the activity outside gradually decreased, and by dawn the visitors had departed, leaving no trace of their presence except for subtle disturbances in the grass and garden areas where they had gathered. Dad conducted a careful inspection of the property and found the same pattern of evidence he'd documented for decades: compressed vegetation, unusual electromagnetic readings on handheld meters, and areas where the soil temperature was several degrees higher than surrounding ground. They come every year, Dad explained as we returned to the house. Same date, same behavior patterns, same interest in testing our responses to their presence. I don't know what they want or where they come from, but I know that following the rules keeps our family safe and prevents whatever complications might result from direct interaction. I've maintained the October 15th ritual for the 15 years since Dad shared the secret with me. When I inherited the family house after Dad's retirement, the visitors continued their annual appearances, apparently treating me as the new primary occupant responsible for maintaining the protocol that had protected our family for decades. I've never determined what the visitors are or why they're attracted to our property, but I've learned to respect the rules that Dad established for managing their presence. The October 15th ritual has become as much a part of my annual routine as tax preparation or holiday planning, an obligation that requires specific preparations and careful adherence to procedures that ensure safety during encounters with entities that exist beyond our normal understanding of what shares the world with human families. The visitors continue to demonstrate knowledge of our lives that extends far beyond what they could observe during their annual appearances, suggesting ongoing surveillance or access to information sources that remain completely mysterious. But as long as we follow Dad's rules and maintain the respectful distance that the ritual enforces, the visits remain observational rather than interactive, allowing us to coexist with entities whose presence reminds us that our remote forest home is shared with intelligences that have their own schedules and purposes for monitoring human domestic life. October 15th represents a date when the boundary between our familiar world and something else becomes permeable enough for annual contact that has continued for over 3 decades, following patterns that suggest the visits serve purposes we're not meant to understand, but that we can manage through careful preparation and strict adherence to protocols designed to maintain separation between human families and entities that exist in the spaces between our documented reality and the unknown territories that surround our everyday domestic existence. I was on a solo camping trip in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia, taking photos of the sunset from my campsite when I noticed something that made me stop and look more carefully at what my phone camera was showing. I'd been documenting the trip with pictures of the scenic overlooks, wildlife, and the gradual transition from afternoon to evening light across the forested ridges that surrounded my camping area. It was early October, and the fall foliage was at its peak, creating spectacular displays of red, orange, and gold that looked even more vivid through the camera viewfinder than they did to my naked eye. I was positioned on a small ridge with a clear view across a valley to another ridge about half a mile away, where dense forest created an unbroken wall of autumn colors against the darkening sky. I was adjusting my phone's camera settings to capture the last few minutes of golden hour lighting when something in the tree line on the opposite ridge caught my attention. Through the camera screen, I could see what appeared to be a brief flash of light among the trees, not the steady glow of a flashlight or the flickering of a campfire, but a quick, bright pulse that lasted maybe half a second before disappearing. At first, I thought it might be sunlight, reflecting off something metallic in the forest, or perhaps the lens flare from another photographer's camera flash. But when I looked up from my phone to scan the distant tree line with my naked eyes, I could see nothing unusual. The forest appeared uniformly dark and undisturbed, with no signs of light sources or human activity anywhere along the ridge. I returned to my phone camera and continued watching the tree line through the viewfinder, hoping to see the flash again and determine what might have caused it. After a few minutes of steady observation, the light appeared again, this time clearly deliberate, and pulsed in a pattern that seemed too regular to be accidental reflection or natural phenomenon. The flash occurred 3 times in quick succession: bright, dark, bright, dark, bright, dark. Then there was a pause of about 10 seconds before the pattern repeated exactly. It was definitely intentional signaling rather than random light reflection. But I was puzzled by who might be flashing lights from deep forest in a remote area of the national forest. I tried signaling back using my phone's flashlight, turning it on and off in the same 3-pulse pattern I'd observed from the tree line. Almost immediately, the distant light responded with a different pattern: 5 quick flashes, followed by a longer pause. It was clearly responding to my signal, engaging in some kind of communication exchange. But what made the situation truly strange was that the flashing light was only visible through my phone camera. When I looked directly at the tree line without the camera, I could see no light sources at all. The forest remained dark and quiet, showing no signs of the systematic flashing that was clearly visible on my phone screen. I experimented with this discrepancy, alternating between looking through the camera and scanning the area with my naked eyes. The pattern was consistent. The light was bright and obvious when viewed through the phone camera, but completely invisible when I looked at the same location directly. It was as if the camera was detecting something that existed outside the range of normal human vision. I tried using the camera's zoom function to get a closer look at the source of the flashing. At maximum zoom, I could see that the light appeared to be coming from a specific location among the trees, but I couldn't make out any details about what was producing it. The light itself seemed unusually bright and pure, almost white with a slight blue tinge that gave it a quality unlike any artificial light source I was familiar with. The signaling continued for about 20 minutes, with the distant light responding to various patterns I tried with my phone's flashlight. Sometimes it would mirror my signals exactly. Sometimes it would respond with completely different patterns that seemed to follow some kind of communication protocol I didn't understand. What disturbed me most was the realization that whatever was producing the light could apparently see my responses, even though I was using a normal LED flashlight that should have been visible to anyone watching from the opposite ridge. The entity or device in the tree line was responding to signals that were clearly visible to normal eyesight, while producing responses that could only be detected through electronic devices. As full darkness settled over the forest, the flashing became more frequent and more complex. Instead of simple patterns, the light began producing sequences that varied in duration, intensity, and repetition rate. It was clearly trying to communicate something more sophisticated than basic acknowledgement signals. I tried recording video of the phenomenon, thinking that I might be able to analyze the light patterns later or share them with someone who might understand what I was witnessing. But when I reviewed the recorded footage, I found something that made the experience even more unsettling. The video showed the tree line clearly, but the flashing light was barely visible in the recording. Just faint, intermittent spots that were much dimmer than what I'd been seeing through the live camera view. It was as if the phenomenon was strongest when observed in real time through electronic viewfinders, but lost much of its intensity when captured for later viewing. Around 9 p.m., the flashing stopped abruptly. I continued watching the tree line through my camera for another hour, trying various signal patterns with my flashlight, but the distant light never returned. The forest remained dark and silent for the rest of the evening, showing no signs of the systematic communication that had been occurring for nearly 2 hours. The next morning, I hiked across the valley to investigate the area where I'd seen the flashing light. It took me about 2 hours to reach the opposite ridge and locate the approximate position where the signals had originated. But I found nothing unusual, just typical forest terrain with no signs of camping, equipment, or any other indication that someone had been there. I searched the area thoroughly, looking for any evidence of human presence or unusual objects that might explain the light phenomena. But the forest floor was undisturbed, covered with normal leaf litter and showing no footprints, equipment marks, or other signs that anyone had been in that location recently. I also checked for natural features that might create unusual optical effects, reflective surfaces, mineral deposits, or anything else that could produce bright flashes when viewed from specific angles. But I found nothing that could account for the systematic, responsive light patterns I'd observed through my phone camera. I've returned to the same camping area several times since then, always bringing my phone and watching the tree line carefully during evening hours. But I've never again observed the mysterious flashing light or encountered any similar phenomena that were visible only through electronic viewfinders. The experience left me questioning What range of the electromagnetic spectrum our electronic devices might be detecting compared to what human eyes can perceive. Perhaps there are forms of communication or presence that exist just outside normal visual range, but that can be detected by the sensors in smartphone cameras and other electronic equipment. I've researched similar reports from other campers and outdoor enthusiasts looking for accounts of lights or phenomena that were visible only through cameras or electronic devices. What I found was a small but consistent collection of stories describing encounters with entities or objects that seem to exist primarily in the range detected by electronic sensors rather than human vision. The flashing light in the Monongahela forest represented some form of intelligence that was capable of observing and responding to human signals while remaining invisible to direct observation. Whether it was advanced technology, a natural phenomenon that operates outside normal visual perception, or some form of entity that exists in electromagnetic spectrums we don't normally access, it demonstrated communication capabilities that extended beyond the range of human sensory detection. My phone camera had served as a window into a layer of activity that occurs constantly around us, but that remains hidden from normal observation. The tree line that appeared empty and quiet to my naked eyes was actually occupied by something that was actively engaged in monitoring and responding to human presence, using communication methods that could only be detected through the electronic devices that have become essential tools for documenting our outdoor experiences. The blinking light reminded me that wilderness areas contain far more activity and intelligence than we realize, operating in frequency ranges and communication protocols that exist beyond the boundaries of human perception, but within the detection capabilities of the electronic equipment we carry into remote areas, without understanding how much additional information those devices might be revealing about what shares the forest with us during our brief visits to territories where other forms of awareness maintain constant observation of our activities. I left Chicago at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, planning to drive straight through to my sister's house in Madison. It was a trip I'd made dozens of times over the years, a simple 3-hour journey up Interstate 90 through familiar Wisconsin farmland. I had a full tank of gas, a travel mug of coffee, and a playlist of old songs that would carry me through the afternoon. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air, brilliant blue sky, and the kind of golden light that makes even the most mundane landscape look like a painting. I remember merging onto the interstate, checking my mirrors, settling into the right lane behind a semi hauling what looked like farm equipment. The radio was playing something by Tom Petty, and I was thinking about my sister's phone call from the night before, how she'd sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Her husband had been laid off 6 months earlier, and they were struggling to keep up with the mortgage payments on their small ranch house. I was bringing a check that would help with November's payment, money I could afford to give, but that they desperately needed to receive. The last clear memory I have from that drive is passing the exit for Belvedere, maybe 40 minutes out of Chicago. I glanced at the dashboard clock and saw it was 2:57 p.m., right on schedule. The coffee was still warm, the gas gauge showed 3/4 full, and the traffic was light enough that I could maintain a steady 70 miles per hour. I was listening to an oldies station, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel to a song I'd heard 1,000 times before. The next thing I remember is pulling into my sister's driveway as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple that belonged to early evening rather than mid-afternoon. I parked behind her car and sat for a moment, confused by the light. Something felt wrong, though I couldn't immediately identify what it was. I looked at my phone to check the time and felt a chill run through me when I saw the display. 6:47 p.m. According to my phone, I had been driving for more than 4 hours, but the trip from Chicago to Madison never took longer than 3, even in heavy traffic. I checked the dashboard clock and found it matched my phone exactly. I tried to remember the last part of the drive, the familiar landmarks, the exit signs, the final turns through Madison's residential streets, but found only a strange blankness, as if someone had carefully erased those hours from my memory. My sister came out to greet me before I could make sense of what had happened. "You made good time," she said, giving me a hug. "I was expecting you around 7. I wanted to tell her that I should have arrived by 5:30 at the latest, that somehow I had lost an hour and a half somewhere between leaving Chicago and reaching her driveway. But the words felt absurd, even as I thought them. Traffic wasn't too bad, I heard myself say, though I had no memory of encountering any traffic at all. We went inside, where she had dinner waiting, pot roast with vegetables, the same meal she'd been making for family gatherings since we were children. As we ate, she asked about my drive, and I found myself giving vague answers about road conditions and weather, avoiding any specifics because I couldn't remember any. After dinner, I excused myself and went out to examine my car more carefully. The odometer showed I had driven 167 miles since leaving Chicago, which was about right for the trip to Madison. But the gas gauge, which had shown 3/4 full when I'd passed Belvedere, now read just over half. I had somehow used more fuel than the distance would suggest, as if I had taken a much longer route or spent time idling somewhere I couldn't recall. I called my sister's phone from my cell, testing whether there might have been some kind of time zone confusion or technical glitch, but both phones showed the same time, synchronized with the network, and Madison was in the same central time zone as Chicago anyway. There was no rational explanation for the missing hours except that I had somehow lost nearly 2 hours of driving time, with no memory of where I had been or what I had done. That night, I lay awake in my sister's guest room, trying to reconstruct the lost portion of my journey. I could remember leaving Chicago clearly, could recall the early part of the drive in perfect detail, but between the Belvedere exit and arriving at my sister's house, there was nothing, not a single landmark, not 1 mile marker, not even the vague impression of having driven through familiar territory. I began to worry that I might have had some kind of medical episode, a seizure or a stroke that had affected my memory while somehow leaving me able to continue driving. But I felt fine physically, and the idea of navigating unfamiliar roads for hours while unconscious or impaired seemed impossible. I would have crashed, gotten lost, or at least attracted the attention of other drivers or police officers. The next morning, I retraced my route home, paying careful attention to every exit and landmark. Everything looked familiar until I reached the Belvedere area, where I had my last clear memory from the previous day. From that point south toward Chicago, the landscape seemed exactly as I remembered it. But the stretch of highway between Belvedere and Madison, which I had driven countless times before, looked somehow different. Not wrong exactly, but subtly altered in ways I couldn't quite identify. I stopped at a rest area near Wisconsin Dells and studied my road atlas, trying to figure out how I might have gotten lost or taken an unintended detour. But there were only so many ways to get from Chicago to Madison, and all of them were clearly marked and well traveled. Even if I had missed an exit or taken a wrong turn, I should have realized my mistake within minutes and corrected course. Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking obsessively about those lost hours. I researched highway hypnosis, the phenomenon where drivers can operate their vehicles automatically while their conscious minds are focused elsewhere. But even in the most extreme cases, people retained some awareness of having driven, some sense of time passing and distance covered. What I had experienced was different, a complete absence of memory, as if I had been somewhere else entirely during those missing hours. I started carrying a digital recorder in my car, speaking my location and the time every few minutes during long drives. It felt paranoid, but I was desperate to avoid losing time again. For months, nothing unusual happened. Every trip was documented, every mile accounted for, every moment of driving time preserved in my increasingly extensive audio logs. Then, almost exactly 1 year later, it happened again. I was driving from Milwaukee to my mother's house in Peoria, another route I knew well, when I found myself sitting in her driveway with no memory of the final 2 hours of the trip. My digital recorder showed a gap in the timeline, my voice clearly stating that I was passing through Rockford at 3:20 p.m., then nothing until I arrived at my destination at 6:15 p.m. This time, I was more systematic in my investigation. I checked my credit card statements for any transactions during the missing hours, but found nothing. I called gas stations and restaurants along my supposed route, asking if they remembered serving someone matching my description, but no one did. I even filed a report with the Illinois State Police, asking if there had been any accidents or incidents involving my license plate number, but their records showed nothing. The pattern continued over the next several years, long drives that would inexplicably extend by an hour or two, with no memory of where I had been or what I had done during the missing time. It didn't happen on every trip, but often enough that I began to dread driving anywhere more than 50 miles from home. I consulted doctors, neurologists, sleep specialists, anyone who might be able to explain what was happening to me. The medical tests revealed nothing unusual. My brain scans were normal, my reflexes were fine, and my cognitive function showed no signs of impairment. One neurologist suggested that I might be experiencing a rare form of dissociative disorder, but the episodes were too specific, too connected to driving, to fit any established pattern of psychological dysfunction. I began to research other people who had experienced similar phenomena, searching online forums and medical journals for any mention of lost driving time. I found a few scattered reports, people who had arrived at their destinations hours later than expected with no memory of the extra time, always on routes they had traveled many times before. But these accounts were rare, dismissed by experts as examples of highway hypnosis or simple confusion about timing. The most disturbing incident occurred 3 years ago during a drive from St. Louis to Kansas City. I lost nearly 3 hours that time, arriving well after dark at what should have been an afternoon destination. But when I checked my car's GPS history the next day, I found something that made my hands shake as I scrolled through the data. According to the device, I had driven almost 200 additional miles during those missing hours, following a route that took me through small towns I had never heard of, on roads that didn't appear on any map I could find. I printed out the GPS log and tried to trace the route on paper, but the coordinates led to empty fields and forests, places where roads supposedly didn't exist. When I drove back to investigate, following the GPS coordinates as precisely as possible, I found only farmland and scattered houses, no evidence of the highways and intersections that my car's navigation system insisted I had traveled. I stopped taking long drives after that, limiting myself to local trips that I could complete in an hour or less. I told my family that I had developed anxiety about highway driving, which wasn't entirely untrue, but the real reason was that I could no longer trust my own experience of time and space when I was behind the wheel for extended periods. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed late at night, I wonder where I go during those lost hours. Am I driving through some parallel version of the familiar landscape, following roads that exist only during certain moments or under specific conditions? Am I experiencing time differently when I'm alone on the highway, moving at speeds that somehow disconnect me from the normal flow of minutes and hours? Or perhaps the explanation is simpler and more disturbing. Maybe those missing hours represent the times when I'm most fully present, most completely myself, and it's the rest of my life that feels like a dream or a half-remembered story. Maybe what I think of as lost time is actually found time, moments when I finally understand something important about the nature of travel and distance and the strange spaces that exist between the places we think we know. I still have my car, though I rarely drive it more than a few miles from home. But sometimes, on clear afternoons, when the light has that particular golden quality that reminds me of autumn drives through the Midwest, I feel the urge to get on the interstate and see what happens. Not to visit family or fulfill any practical purpose, but simply to drive until I lose track of time again, to surrender to whatever process has been calling me, to those unmappable places where hours can disappear like morning fog and the familiar becomes impossible to recall. I was sitting on the dock at my uncle's cabin when I first heard the humming. It was late June, that perfect time of year when the northern Minnesota lakes are warm enough for swimming, but the mosquitoes haven't yet reached their summer fury. I'd come up for a week of solitude after my divorce was finalized, needing the kind of silence that only comes from being completely alone in a place where your cell phone has no signal and the nearest neighbor is 3 miles away through dense forest. The cabin sits on the eastern shore of Loon Lake, a body of water so remote that it doesn't appear on most maps. My uncle built the place in the 1970s, back when you could still buy undeveloped lakefront for the price of a decent used car. It's a simple structure, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room with windows that face west toward the water. The dock extends maybe 20 feet into the lake, ending where the sandy bottom drops off into the kind of deep, dark water that seems to hold secrets. I'd been there for 3 days, falling into the rhythm of lake life. Coffee at sunrise, reading in the afternoon, simple dinners cooked on the propane stove while watching the sun set behind the trees on the far shore. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a loon or the splash of a beaver somewhere in the distance. It was exactly what I needed, a chance to remember who I was when stripped of all the complications that had accumulated over 15 years of marriage. The humming started around 9 in the evening, just as the last light was fading from the sky. I was sitting on the end of the dock with a cup of tea, watching the first stars appear in the clear northern sky, when I became aware of a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was low, barely audible, like the distant drone of a large engine or the resonance of a tuning fork struck far away. But there was something musical about it, a quality that suggested intention rather than mechanical accident. At first, I thought it might be a boat somewhere on the lake, though I hadn't seen any other vessels during my 3 days there. The sound was too steady and too pure to be an outboard motor, but lakes can carry sounds in strange ways, and distance can transform the familiar into the mysterious. I stood up and scanned the water, looking for navigation lights or the wake of a passing craft. But the lake's surface was perfectly still, reflecting the stars like a dark mirror. The humming continued for perhaps 10 minutes, neither growing louder nor fading away, maintaining the same gentle intensity throughout. It wasn't unpleasant. In fact, there was something soothing about it, like a lullaby hummed by a voice too distant to identify. But as I listened more carefully, I began to realize that the sound wasn't coming from the water at all. It was coming from above. I looked up and saw it then, suspended about 50 feet above the center of the lake. At first, it was just a shape against the stars, darker than the sky around it, roughly circular and perhaps 30 feet in diameter. It hung motionless in the air, defying every law of physics I understood, making no sound except for that low, musical humming that seemed to emanate from its very structure. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, certain that fatigue or stress was causing me to see things that weren't there. But the object remained, solid and undeniable, a presence that transformed the familiar lake into something alien and strange. It wasn't a balloon or a helicopter or any kind of aircraft I could identify. It simply existed in the space above the water, patient and silent except for that continuous, gentle song. The humming had a rhythm to it, I realized, a subtle pulse that might have been synchronized with my heartbeat, or might have been causing my heart to synchronize with it. I couldn't tell which. There was something hypnotic about the sound, something that made it difficult to look away from the floating object or to think clearly about what I was witnessing. I felt calm in a way that didn't match the strangeness of the situation, as if the humming was designed to soothe observers rather than alarm them. I sat back down on the dock, deciding that I would simply watch and wait to see what happened next. The rational part of my mind was insisting that I go inside, call someone, document what I was seeing, but a larger part of me was content to remain still and observe. The object wasn't threatening. It made no aggressive movements, emitted no harsh lights, showed no interest in me at all. It simply hovered above the lake, humming its quiet song to the night sky. As my eyes adjusted further to the darkness, I began to see more details. The object's surface seemed to ripple slightly, like water or liquid metal, and there were patterns visible on its underside, geometric shapes that might have been panels or seams or something else entirely. The humming grew more complex as I listened, revealing harmonies and overtones that suggested multiple voices or instruments working together in perfect synchronization. I lost track of time sitting there. The object remained motionless while the stars wheeled slowly overhead, marking the passage of hours I barely noticed. The humming continued without variation, that same gentle, hypnotic tone that seemed to resonate not just in my ears but in my chest, my bones, the wooden planks of the dock beneath me. I felt more peaceful than I had in months, as if the sound was washing away the accumulated stress and sadness of the past year. Sometime after midnight, the object began to move, not quickly or dramatically, but with the same deliberate grace it had shown while hovering. It drifted slowly eastward, staying at the same height above the water, the humming gradually fading as it moved away from me. I watched until it disappeared beyond the tree line on the far shore, leaving only the familiar sounds of the night. Wind in the pines, the gentle lap of water against the dock, the distant call of an owl somewhere in the forest. I sat there for another hour, waiting to see if it would return, but the lake had returned to normal. The stars reflected peacefully on the dark water, and the only movement was the occasional ripple caused by a fish surfacing or a beaver swimming across the shallow bay near the cabin. Eventually, I went inside and tried to sleep, but my dreams were filled with that humming sound, as if it had taken up residence somewhere deep in my memory. The next morning, I walked around the lake, looking for any physical evidence of what I had witnessed. I found nothing, no disturbed vegetation, no unusual marks on the ground, no debris that might have fallen from the floating object. The lake and the surrounding forest appeared exactly as they had before, pristine and undisturbed. I began to wonder if I had dreamed the entire experience, if the isolation and emotional exhaustion of the divorce had caused me to hallucinate something that had never been there at all. But that evening, around the same time, I heard the humming again. I was inside the cabin, washing dinner dishes, when the sound drifted through the open windows. I stepped onto the porch and saw the object in the same position as the night before, hovering motionless above the center of the lake. This time, I was prepared. I tried to take photographs with my camera, but every image came out as nothing more than dark sky and water, as if the object was invisible to electronic sensors. I spent the rest of my week at the cabin, documenting the phenomenon as carefully as I could. The object appeared every night at almost exactly the same time, remaining in position for 2 to 3 hours before drifting away toward the east. The humming was always identical, that same low musical tone with its complex harmonies and subtle rhythms. I recorded it on my phone, but when I played back the audio, I heard only the normal sounds of a quiet evening by the lake. On my last night, I decided to try communicating with whatever was controlling the object. I brought a flashlight to the dock, and when the humming began, I flashed a simple pattern: 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, Morse code for SOS, the universal distress signal. I repeated it several times, pointing the beam directly at the floating form above the water. For a moment, nothing changed. Then gradually, the humming shifted to a different tone, higher and more complex than before. The pattern of the sound seemed to mirror the rhythm of my flashlight signal. 3 short pulses, 3 longer ones, 3 short again. But where my signal had been desperate and crude, the response was elegant and musical, as if my simple message had been transformed into something beautiful. I tried other patterns, long flashes, short bursts, random sequences, and each time the humming would shift to reflect what I had sent, interpreting my clumsy light signals as music and returning them as song. We continued this exchange for nearly an hour, and by the end, I felt like I had participated in a conversation conducted entirely in light and sound, meaning and emotion transcending the barrier of language. When the object finally drifted away that last night, the humming faded with a series of tones that sounded unmistakably like a farewell. I flashed my light 3 times in response and watched until the shape disappeared beyond the trees, leaving me alone with the sudden understanding that I had been changed by what I had witnessed. I returned to the city the next day, but I've never been able to forget those nights by the lake. I've researched every possible explanation: experimental aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, mass hallucination, but nothing comes close to accounting for what I experienced. The object's behavior was too deliberate, too responsive, too purposeful to be explained by natural causes or human technology. I've been back to the lake several times since then, always hoping to see the humming object again. Sometimes I think I hear faint echoes of that musical tone carried on the wind, and once I could have sworn I saw a dark shape moving slowly across the stars. But I've never again witnessed anything as clear and undeniable as those 5 nights in June when something impossible floated above the water and sang to me in a language I didn't understand, but somehow comprehended perfectly. I keep the experience to myself mostly. People would think I was crazy, or attention-seeking, or suffering from some kind of delayed stress reaction to my divorce. But sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly isolated or disconnected from the world, I remember the gentle humming that seemed to resonate in harmony with my own heartbeat. And I know that somewhere above the dark water of a remote lake, there are things that exist beyond our understanding, patient and musical and utterly alien, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves to those who need to know that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than we usually allow ourselves to believe. I'd been working the night shift at Mel's Diner for 3 years, serving coffee and pie to truckers, insomniacs, and the occasional lost traveler who found their way to our little truck stop on Highway 287 outside of Amarillo. It was the kind of place where you got to know the regular customers, where conversations followed predictable patterns, and where surprises were rare enough to be noteworthy. That's what made the events of last Tuesday night so unsettling. It was around 2:30 a.m., and the diner was nearly empty except for Earl, a long-haul trucker who stopped by every few weeks, and a young couple who'd been nursing coffee and sharing a piece of apple pie for the past hour. I was wiping down tables and refilling salt shakers when the bell above the door chimed to announce another customer. The woman who walked in was probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and clothes that looked expensive but understated. She wasn't the type of customer we usually saw during the late shift. Too well dressed for a trucker, too old to be a college student driving through the night, too composed to be someone dealing with a roadside emergency. She looked around the diner with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was looking for something specific. She chose a booth near the window and picked up a menu, though she seemed more interested in watching me than in reading about our food options. When I approached her table with a pot of coffee, she looked up at me with a smile that was both warm and somehow familiar, though I was certain I'd never seen her before. "Good evening, Rebecca," she said, and my hand froze halfway to turning over her coffee cup. I hadn't been wearing a name tag. Mine had broken earlier in the week, and I'd been meaning to request a replacement. There was nothing visible that would have told her my name, and I was sure I'd never served her before. In 3 years of working nights at Mel's, I'd developed a good memory for faces, especially unusual customers who stood out from our typical late-night crowd. I asked, setting the coffee pot down on the table and studying her face more carefully. "Not exactly," she replied, pouring cream into her coffee with steady hands. "But I know quite a bit about you. You're Rebecca Martinez, 26 years old, originally from El Paso. You moved to Amarillo 3 years ago after your divorce, and you've been working here ever since." Every detail was correct, but I felt my stomach drop as I realized that this information wasn't something a stranger should have known. My personal life wasn't public knowledge, and I'd been careful about privacy since my divorce. I hadn't told most of my coworkers about my plans for nursing school, and I certainly hadn't shared my address with customers. I asked, glancing around the diner to see if Earl or the young couple had noticed our conversation, but they seemed absorbed in their own activities, apparently unaware that anything unusual was happening. "I know because it's my job to know," the woman said calmly. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and I work for an organization that monitors certain individuals who have had unusual experiences." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. 6 months ago, I'd had an experience that I'd never told anyone about, an encounter that I'd tried to convince myself was a stress-induced hallucination or a vivid dream. But this stranger seemed to know about it, which meant that either I hadn't imagined it or someone had been watching me more closely than I'd realized. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, though my voice sounded unconvincing even to myself. Dr. Chen opened a small briefcase that she'd placed beside her on the booth seat and withdrew a manila folder. She opened it and showed me a photograph that made my hands start shaking. It was a picture of me standing in my backyard at night, looking up at something in the sky. But what made the photo truly disturbing was that I remembered the moment it captured, and I was certain that no one else had been present when it was taken. This was taken on March 15th at approximately 11:47 p.m., Dr. Chen said, showing me additional photos that documented the entire encounter I'd tried so hard to forget. "You observed an unidentified aerial phenomenon for approximately 12 minutes. You attempted to photograph it with your phone, but the images didn't develop properly. The photos showed everything exactly as I remembered it. The strange lights moving in patterns that defied conventional aircraft behavior, my own attempts to document what I was seeing, and my obvious fascination and fear as I watched something that shouldn't have existed according to everything I understood about reality. I asked, sitting down across from her without being invited. I represent an organization that investigates reports of unusual phenomena and monitors individuals who have had significant encounters, she explained. She showed me more documents from the folder, detailed reports of my movements and activities over the past 6 months, including places I'd visited, people I'd talked to, and even conversations I'd had that no one should have been able to record. The level of surveillance was far beyond anything I'd imagined possible, and it suggested resources and capabilities that extended well beyond normal law enforcement or private investigation. I asked, feeling increasingly trapped by the realization that my privacy had been completely compromised for months without my knowledge. "We want to offer you an opportunity," Dr. Chen said, closing the folder and leaning forward with an expression that seemed genuinely concerned. "People who have had encounters like yours often experience additional phenomena." She explained that her organization was recruiting individuals with proven sensitivity to anomalous phenomena, people who could serve as early warning systems for activities that traditional monitoring couldn't detect. The work would involve regular reports about anything unusual I observed, participation in periodic interviews and testing, and cooperation with investigations that might arise from my observations. I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Then you'll continue to be monitored from a distance," she said matter-of-factly, "but you won't receive the protection and support that comes with official cooperation." She left a business card with a phone number and told me I had 48 hours to decide whether to accept their offer. Then she paid for her coffee, left a generous tip, and walked out of the diner as quietly as she'd arrived. I spent the rest of my shift trying to process what had happened, replaying our conversation and examining the business card that bore no company name, just Dr. Chen's name and a phone number with an area code I didn't recognize. When Earl asked if I was feeling okay, I realized that I'd been standing motionless behind the counter for several minutes, staring at the card in my hand. The next day, I tried researching Dr. Sarah Chen and the phone number she'd given me, but found no information that would help me understand what organization she represented or what I might be agreeing to if I accepted her offer. The phone number traced to a disconnected line, and there were no online references to anyone matching her description in connection with unusual phenomena research. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched more closely than before. Cars seemed to follow me for longer distances. People appeared to be taking my photo from across parking lots, and I received phone calls that disconnected immediately when I answered. 2 days later, I called the number Dr. Chen had given me. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for my call. "I accept your offer," I said, partly because I was curious about what the work would involve, and partly because I hoped that cooperation might provide some protection from the surveillance that was making my daily life increasingly uncomfortable. That was 3 months ago. Since then, I've been filing weekly reports about anything unusual I observe, participating in monthly interviews about my experiences and observations, and wearing a small device that Dr. Chen claims helps protect me from unwanted attention by entities that are attracted to people who have had encounters with anomalous phenomena. I still work at Mel's Diner, but now I know that some of our customers aren't what they appear to be. I've learned to recognize the signs of people who are monitoring rather than simply stopping for food and coffee. And I've come to understand that my encounter 6 months ago marked me as someone of interest to organizations that operate far beyond normal government or corporate structures. The night shift at the diner has become more interesting since I started paying attention to the subtle signs that Dr. Chen taught me to recognize. I see things now that I never noticed before, conversations that stop when I approach, customers who pay attention to things that normal travelers wouldn't notice, vehicles that appear in our parking lot more frequently than random chance would suggest. I don't know exactly what organization Dr. Chen represents or what larger purpose my reports serve, but I've learned that the world contains far more surveillance and far more unusual activity than most people realize. And sometimes, late at night when the diner is quiet and I'm wiping down tables, I wonder how many other people have been approached by strangers who know their names and their secrets, offered choices between cooperation and continued surveillance, and inducted into networks of observation that monitor activities occurring just beyond the edge of normal awareness. The business card Dr. Chen gave me now sits in my wallet as a reminder that privacy is an illusion and that some encounters change your life in ways you never expect, connecting you to organizations and activities that exist in the spaces between official acknowledgement and hidden reality. I was working the night shift at the water treatment plant when I first saw it. This was back in 2019, before everything changed, when I still believed the world operated according to rules I understood. The plant sits on the outskirts of town, surrounded by scrubland and a few scattered farmhouses, and from my position in the control room, I had a clear view of the cell tower about half a mile to the east. It was one of those tall, lattice structures, maybe 300 feet high, with the usual array of equipment mounted near the top and red warning lights that blinked steadily through the night. I'd been monitoring the filtration systems for about 3 hours when I decided to take a break. The coffee was burnt and bitter, the way it always was after midnight, but I needed the caffeine to stay alert. I was standing at the window, looking out at the darkness and sipping from my mug when I noticed something moving on the tower. At first, I thought it might be a maintenance worker, though it would have been unusual for someone to be working at 2 in the morning. I set down my coffee and picked up the binoculars we kept on the windowsill for checking the intake pipes. What I saw through the lenses made me lower the binoculars and rub my eyes. Then I looked again, thinking perhaps fatigue was playing tricks on me, but it was still there, about halfway up the tower, climbing steadily toward the top. The shape was wrong, though, too long, too fluid in its movements. It wasn't a person in coveralls with safety equipment. It was something else entirely. The thing was perhaps 8 feet long, maybe more, with a body that seemed to flow rather than move in discrete segments. It clung to the metal framework with what looked like multiple appendages, though the distance and darkness made it difficult to count them precisely. The way it moved reminded me of a caterpillar, but scaled up impossibly large, and with a purposefulness that seemed almost intelligent. It climbed smoothly, without hesitation, as if it had done this many times before. I watched for maybe 10 minutes, transfixed by the slow, methodical progress. The creature, I couldn't think of any other word for it, reached the first equipment platform and paused there, seeming to examine the machinery mounted on the tower. It extended what might have been a head or sensory organ toward the metal housing of what I knew was a cellular repeater. For a moment, it remained perfectly still, and I had the strange impression that it was listening to something, or perhaps tasting the air. Then it resumed climbing, moving past the equipment array toward the very top of the tower. The red warning lights continued their steady blinking, casting brief glimpses of the creature's form in crimson flashes. Its surface appeared smooth, almost reflective, and in those moments when the light hit it directly, I could see what looked like segmentation along its length, like joints or natural divisions in its body. But between the flashes, it seemed to blend with the darkness, becoming almost invisible against the night sky. When it reached the top of the tower, it coiled itself around the uppermost section, wrapping its length around the metal framework in a spiral pattern. From my vantage point, it looked like it was embracing the tower, holding it in some kind of intimate contact. It remained in that position for what felt like a long time, though I was too absorbed in watching to check the clock. The normal sounds of the plant, the hum of pumps, the whisper of water through pipes, seemed muted, as if the very air had become thicker. I should have been afraid, I suppose. Any rational person would have been terrified by what I was seeing. But instead, I felt a strange sense of calm, almost meditative. There was something hypnotic about the creature's movements, something that suggested patience and purpose rather than threat. It wasn't aggressive or chaotic. It was simply there, doing whatever it was that it did, following some pattern of behavior that made perfect sense to it, even if I couldn't understand it. Eventually, it began to descend, moving with the same fluid grace it had shown while climbing. I watched it work its way down the tower, past the equipment arrays, past the guy wire attachment points, until it reached the base. There it seemed to pause again, and for a moment I thought it might be looking in my direction, though the distance was too great for me to be certain. Then it moved away from the tower, across the open ground, and disappeared into the darkness beyond my sight. I stood at the window for another hour, hoping to see it again, but the night had returned to normal. The tower stood silent and empty, its red lights blinking their steady rhythm, and I began to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. 12-hour shifts can play tricks on the mind, especially in the small hours when the body's rhythms are at their lowest ebb. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew I hadn't been dreaming. The next morning, I called the telecommunications company that owned the tower to report possible unauthorized access. The technician I spoke with was polite but skeptical, asking whether I had seen any vehicles or equipment that might indicate a service crew. When I tried to describe what I had actually witnessed, he grew quiet, then suggested I might want to contact the local police if I was concerned about trespassing. I thanked him and hung up, realizing how my story must have sounded to someone who hadn't been there. I drove out to the tower the following evening, parking my car at the base and walking around the perimeter. The ground was hard-packed earth and scattered gravel, not the kind of surface that would hold clear footprints. but I searched anyway for any sign of the creature's presence. I found nothing unusual, no disturbed soil, no shed scales or strange residue, no indication that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. The tower stood exactly as it always had, a utilitarian structure of steel and cables reaching toward the sky. Over the next few weeks, I made a point of watching the tower during my shifts, but I saw nothing unusual. The red lights blinked, the equipment hummed its electronic songs, and the structure remained empty of anything except its intended purpose. I began to think that perhaps I had experienced some kind of hallucination brought on by stress or fatigue or the peculiar isolation of working nights in an industrial facility. But then, almost 2 months later, I saw it again. This time, I was ready. I had purchased a small video camera and kept it with me during my shifts, hoping to document whatever I might see. The creature appeared around midnight, emerging from the darkness as before and beginning its slow ascent of the tower. I filmed what I could, though the distance and lighting conditions made it difficult to capture clear images. When I reviewed the footage later, I could see something moving on the tower, but it was indistinct, ambiguous, the kind of thing that could be explained away as shadows or equipment malfunction. I saw it 5 more times over the course of that year, always following the same pattern, appearing after midnight, climbing to the top, remaining there for an extended period, then descending and disappearing into the darkness. Each time, I tried to document what I was seeing, but the evidence was always frustratingly inconclusive. Photos were blurry, videos were dark and grainy, and my written descriptions sounded increasingly fantastic even to me. I began researching similar sightings online, searching through forums and databases for any reports of large climbing creatures near telecommunications infrastructure. I found plenty of stories about strange animals in unusual places, but nothing that matched what I was witnessing. I considered contacting cryptozoology researchers, but I was reluctant to expose myself to ridicule or to invite unwanted attention to my workplace. The sightings stopped abruptly in late autumn. I continued to watch the tower through the winter and into the following spring, but the creature never returned. I was transferred to day shift that summer, and though I occasionally drove past the tower on my way to work, I never saw anything unusual during daylight hours. The structure looked ordinary, functional, unremarkable in every way. I retired from the water treatment plant 2 years ago, but I still think about what I saw climbing that tower. I've developed theories over the years. Perhaps it was some kind of unknown species drawn to the electromagnetic fields generated by the cellular equipment. Or maybe it was something that exists in the spaces between our normal perceptions, visible only under certain conditions of light and shadow and solitude. I've even considered the possibility that it was never there at all, that it was some kind of projection of my own mind, a symbol of something I needed to see but couldn't name. What I know for certain is that for 1 year, during the quiet hours of the night shift, I shared the darkness with something that didn't belong to the world as I understood it. It wasn't malevolent or threatening, it was simply other, following its own mysterious purposes in the spaces we've filled with our towers and signals and electric lights. And sometimes, when I'm driving at night and I see the red lights of a cell tower blinking in the distance, I find myself slowing down, scanning the metal framework for any sign of movement, wondering if somewhere out there, in the vast network of towers that connects our modern world, something is still climbing toward the stars, patient and purposeful and utterly alone. The metal detector was supposed to be a retirement hobby, something to get me outside and maybe find a few interesting coins or pieces of old jewelry. I'd bought it 3 months after I finished my last day teaching high school chemistry, thinking it would give me a reason to explore the countryside around our house in rural Oregon. What I found in my own backyard wasn't what I was looking for, and it's changed the way I think about what might be hidden just beneath the surface of our everyday world. Our house sits on 5 acres, about 10 miles outside of Corvallis, on land that my wife Janet and I bought 20 years ago when we were still young enough to think we'd eventually build a bigger place. We never did build that bigger house, but we'd grown attached to the quiet and the space, the way you could step outside at night and actually see the Milky Way. The property is mostly open field with a few stands of Douglas fir, and we never done much with the backyard except mow it and plant a small vegetable garden near the house. It was a Saturday morning in late March when I decided to try out the metal detector in our own yard before venturing out to public parks or beaches. The ground was still soft from the spring rains, and I figured it would be good practice to learn how the machine worked on familiar terrain. Janet was inside reading, and I had the whole morning to myself to figure out the various settings and sensitivity levels. I started near the house, working in a systematic grid pattern like I'd read about in the instruction manual. For the first hour, I found the usual suburban detritus, a few bottle caps, some aluminum can pull tabs, a handful of corroded nails that were probably from construction work we'd had done over the years. The detector would beep. I'd dig a small hole, retrieve whatever piece of metal was buried there, and fill the hole back in. Around 10:30, I was working an area about 50 yards from the house, near the edge of what we optimistically called our orchard. 4 apple trees we'd planted years ago that never quite thrived in our clay soil. The detector gave a strong, clear signal, the kind that usually indicates something substantial rather than just a piece of trash. I marked the spot with a small flag and started digging. The object was about 18 inches down, buried deeper than anything else I'd found that morning. As I cleared the dirt away with my small shovel, I could see it was metallic and roughly cylindrical, maybe 8 inches long and 3 inches in diameter. But what struck me immediately was that it was warm to the touch, noticeably warmer than the cool spring soil surrounding it. I assumed at first that it must have been conducting heat from somewhere, maybe a buried utility line or some kind of geothermal effect. But as I carefully excavated around it, I could see that it was completely isolated, surrounded by the same clay soil that made up the rest of our yard. There were no cables, no pipes, nothing that could have been transferring heat to it. When I finally worked it free and lifted it out of the hole, I could feel the warmth through my work gloves. The object was smooth and seamless, made of what looked like stainless steel or some similar alloy, with no visible joints, welds, or manufacturing marks. It was heavier than I expected, probably 6 or 7 pounds, and it had a subtle geometric pattern etched into its surface, not decorative exactly, but purposeful, like it meant something. One end of the cylinder was flat, while the other had a gentle dome shape. The entire surface was mirror smooth, except for the etched patterns, which formed interconnected lines and angles that seemed to flow around the circumference in a way that was pleasing to look at, but impossible to follow completely. The metal felt warm and almost alive under my hands, as if there were some kind of energy source inside it. I sat in the grass next to the hole I'd dug, turning the object over in my hands and trying to make sense of what I'd found. It clearly wasn't a piece of ordinary household metal. The craftsmanship was too precise, the material too sophisticated, but it also didn't look like any kind of industrial component I was familiar with, and I'd seen plenty of those during my years teaching chemistry. What bothered me most was the heat. I held the object for nearly 20 minutes, and it never cooled down. If anything, it seemed to maintain a constant temperature that was maybe 10 or 15 degrees warmer than the ambient air. There was no vibration, no sound, no other indication of what might be generating that warmth, but it was definitely coming from inside the object itself. I took it into the house to show Janet. She was as puzzled as I was, though she was more focused on the practical questions. Where had it come from? How long had it been buried? Should we report it to someone? I was more fascinated by the technical aspects. What kind of metal stayed warm without any apparent power source? What were those patterns etched into the surface? We put it on the kitchen table and spent the next hour examining it more closely. Under good light, the patterns became more complex and detailed than they had appeared outside. They weren't random decorations. They had the look of technical diagrams, or perhaps some kind of script. The lines varied in depth and width, creating a texture that was subtle, but definitely intentional. Janet suggested we take it to the university, where someone in the materials science department might be able to identify the alloy or explain the heat generation. But something held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that this object was meant to be private, that whatever it was, it had been hidden for a reason. Over the following days, I found myself spending more and more time studying the cylinder. I measured it carefully, photographed the patterns from every angle, and even tried making rubbings to capture the detail of the etchings. The heat never varied. It remained consistently warm, day and night, regardless of the ambient temperature. On the fourth day, I noticed that the patterns seemed to be slowly changing. It was subtle at first, just a sense that something was different when I looked at the object. But when I compared new photographs to the ones I'd taken earlier, I could see that some of the lines had definitely shifted position. Not dramatically, but enough to be measurable. The etched patterns were moving, rearranging themselves in slow motion across the surface of the cylinder. This discovery filled me with a mixture of excitement and unease. Whatever this object was, it was clearly more than just a piece of sophisticated metalwork. It was active, changing, responding to something in a way that defied my understanding of how metal objects should behave. I started keeping a daily photographic record, documenting the changes in the patterns. Over the course of 2 weeks, I watched as the etchings gradually rearranged themselves into new configurations. Sometimes the changes were geometric, creating different symmetries and relationships between the lines. Sometimes they seemed more organic, flowing like water or growing like roots. Janet grew increasingly concerned about my obsession with the object. She pointed out that I was spending hours every day staring at it, measuring it, photographing it. She worried about the unknown material it was made from, whether it might be radioactive or toxic. She urged me again to take it to experts who could analyze it properly, but I felt protective of it, almost possessive. This thing had been buried in my yard, waiting for me to find it. The slow dance of patterns across its surface felt like a form of communication, though I had no idea what it might be trying to tell me. I was convinced that if I studied it long enough, I would begin to understand its purpose. 3 weeks after I found it, the patterns stopped changing. They settled into a new configuration that was more complex than anything I'd seen before, an intricate mandala of interconnected lines that seemed to pulse with their own internal logic. The object remained warm, but it felt different somehow, more settled, as if it had reached some kind of completion. That night, I had a dream that was more vivid than any I'd ever experienced. I was standing in the same spot in our backyard where I'd found the cylinder, but the landscape was different. The grass was greener, the sky was a deeper blue, and there were structures in the distance that didn't belong to our world. Tall, graceful buildings that seemed to be made of the same material as the cylinder. In the dream, I wasn't alone. There were others there, beings that looked almost human, but not quite, watching me with expressions of patient kindness. One of them approached and held out their hand. Without speaking, I understood that they wanted the cylinder back. I gave it to them, and they nodded in acknowledgement before turning and walking away toward those impossible buildings. I woke up knowing that the object needed to be returned to where I'd found it. I went out to the backyard before sunrise, carrying the cylinder and a small shovel. The hole I'd filled in 3 weeks earlier was easy to locate, and I dug it out again, making it slightly deeper this time. I placed the cylinder carefully in the bottom of the hole, oriented exactly as I had found it. As I began to cover it with soil, I could swear I felt it pulse once, gently like a heartbeat. By the time Janet woke up, I had finished filling in the hole and smoothing the ground. I told her I had returned the object to where it belonged, and though she asked why, I couldn't give her an answer that made rational sense. I just knew it was the right thing to do. That was 6 months ago. I still use the metal detector occasionally, but I've never found anything else unusual. Sometimes I walk out to the spot where the cylinder is buried, and I think I can feel a faint warmth radiating up from the ground, though that might just be my imagination. I've thought a lot about what that object might have been, some kind of beacon, perhaps, or a message, or a piece of technology so advanced that it might as well be magic. I think about the dream and the beings who seem to be waiting for its return. I wonder if there are others like it, buried in backyards and fields around the world, waiting to be found by people who are curious enough to dig, but wise enough to eventually let go. The experience changed something in me. I look at the world differently now, more aware of the possibility that extraordinary things might be hidden in the most ordinary places. Our backyard looks the same as it always did, but I know that beneath the surface, just 18 inches down, something warm and mysterious waits in the darkness, keeping its own counsel about the nature of reality and our place within it. I was 3 hours into what should have been a routine drive from Denver to Kansas City when the world around me shifted into something that felt fundamentally wrong. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September, the kind of perfect autumn day when the prairie stretches endlessly under clear blue skies and you can see approaching weather systems from 50 miles away. I'd made this drive dozens of times for work, and I knew every truck stop, every small town, every mile marker along the way. I was somewhere between Colby and Oakley, driving east on I-70 through the heart of Kansas wheat country when I first noticed the change in the light. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the quality of the sunshine that made me glance up at the sky through my windshield. What I saw there made me slow down and eventually pull over to the shoulder of the highway. The sky was turning orange, not the warm, gradual orange of sunset, which was still hours away, but a sudden uniform orange that seemed to be spreading across the entire dome of the sky like spilled paint. It started at the western horizon and moved eastward with visible speed, transforming the familiar blue of afternoon into something alien and unsettling. I got out of my car and stood beside the highway, watching this impossible phenomenon unfold above me. The orange deepened as it spread, becoming more intense and more uniform until the entire sky looked like the inside of a pumpkin. But there were no clouds, no visible source for the color change. The sun was still visible as a brighter disk within the orange expanse, but it provided no explanation for what was happening to the atmosphere around it. As the sky completed its transformation, something else changed that was even more disturbing than the visual anomaly. The world became silent, not just quiet, completely, utterly silent, in a way that felt physically oppressive. The constant background noise that you don't notice until it's gone, wind through grass, distant traffic, the hum of insects, even the sound of my own breathing, all of it simply stopped. I stood on the shoulder of Interstate 70, surrounded by thousands of acres of prairie and farmland, and heard absolutely nothing. No birds, no wind, no rustle of vegetation. When I clapped my hands together, the sound seemed muffled and strange, as if the air itself had become too thick to carry sound properly. My footsteps on the gravel shoulder sounded distant and hollow, like I was hearing them through water. The silence was so complete that it made me dizzy. I realized how much we depend on subtle, auditory cues to orient ourselves in space, and without them, the world felt unstable and dreamlike. I could see cars in the distance on the highway, but I couldn't hear their engines. I could see a farmhouse maybe half a mile away, but there was no sound of machinery, no barking dogs, no signs of life that I could detect through my ears. I got back in my car and tried the radio, thinking that maybe whatever was causing the atmospheric disturbance might also be affecting electromagnetic signals. But the radio worked normally, picking up stations from Denver and Kansas City with clear reception. The music and voices from the speakers sounded normal inside the car, but when I rolled down the windows, the outside world remained locked in that unnatural silence. I started driving again, partly because staying in one place felt more frightening than moving, and partly because I hoped that whatever phenomenon I was experiencing might be localized to a particular area. But as I continued east on I-70, the orange sky and the oppressive silence traveled with me. Other vehicles were on the highway. I could see them in the distance and in my mirrors, but they seemed to be moving through the same strange atmosphere that had enveloped me. For the next hour, I drove through this transformed landscape, watching familiar landmarks appear and disappear under the orange sky. The grain elevators and farmhouses looked the same, but they seemed somehow less real, like props in a movie set rather than actual buildings where people lived and worked. The wheat fields stretched to the horizon as they always did, but under the orange light they looked alien and unsettling. I tried calling my office on my cell phone to report what I was experiencing, but while the phone showed good signal strength, every call went straight to voicemail without ringing. Text messages seemed to send normally, but I received no responses. It was as if I had been cut off from the rest of the world, isolated in this bubble of orange light and unnatural silence. The strangest part was how other drivers seemed to be reacting to the phenomenon. I could see cars ahead of me and behind me, all traveling at normal highway speeds, but no one was pulling over or showing signs of distress. It was as if I were the only person who could see the orange sky or notice the absence of sound. When I passed other vehicles, or they passed me, the drivers looked completely normal, focused on the road ahead as if nothing unusual was happening. Around 4:30 p.m., about 2 hours after the phenomenon had begun, I noticed a change. The orange began to fade from the western edge of the sky, retreating eastward with the same visible speed it had arrived with. As the normal blue of afternoon returned, sound gradually came back to the world. First a faint whisper of wind, then the distant hum of traffic, then the full spectrum of environmental noise that makes the world feel alive and real. Within 15 minutes, everything had returned to normal. The sky was its familiar blue, scattered with a few white clouds that looked perfectly ordinary. The prairie wind was audible again. Birds were calling from fence posts, and the highway carried the usual sounds of traffic and civilization. It was as if the previous 2 hours had been erased, leaving no trace of the orange light or the oppressive silence. I pulled into the next rest area and sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to process what I had just experienced. I called my office again, and this time the phone rang normally. When my secretary answered, I asked if she'd received my earlier calls or text messages. She said she'd gotten a text from me about 2 hours earlier, saying I was making good time on the drive, but nothing since then. I checked local news websites and weather services, looking for any reports of unusual atmospheric conditions or unexplained phenomena in central Kansas, but I found nothing. No reports of strange weather, no social media posts about orange skies, no indication that anyone else had experienced what I had just lived through. I continued my drive to Kansas City, arriving on schedule that evening. During business meetings over the following days, I casually asked colleagues if they'd heard any unusual stories about atmospheric phenomena or weather anomalies in Kansas. But no one had any information, and my careful inquiries produced nothing but puzzled looks and suggestions that I might have witnessed some kind of unusual dust storm or optical illusion. I've made that same drive numerous times since then, always paying careful attention to the sky and the ambient sound levels as I cross the Kansas prairie. But I've never again experienced anything like those 2 hours when the world transformed into something alien and unsettling. The sky remains blue, the wind continues to blow across the wheat fields, and the familiar sounds of rural life provide their constant background reassurance. But the experience changed how I think about the apparent stability of our environment. For 2 hours, I drove through a version of Kansas that existed according to different rules, where light behaved strangely and sound simply didn't exist. It was the same landscape I'd traveled through many times before, but it had been temporarily transformed into something that felt like it belonged to a different planet. I've researched atmospheric phenomena, electromagnetic anomalies, and various scientific explanations for unusual sky colors and acoustic effects. While there are documented cases of strange atmospheric conditions that can affect light and sound, nothing I've found adequately explains the uniformity and completeness of what I experienced. The orange sky was too consistent, the silence too absolute, the duration too long to match any known meteorological phenomenon. Sometimes I wonder if I somehow drove through a gap in reality, a place where the normal rules of physics were temporarily suspended or replaced by something else. The fact that other drivers seemed unaffected suggests that the phenomenon might have been somehow specific to my perception, but I know what I saw and heard, or failed to hear. It was too real, too detailed, too consistent to have been a hallucination or psychological episode. The Kansas prairie looks the same as it always did when I drive through it now, but I know that beneath its familiar appearance lies the possibility of transformation into something far stranger. Somewhere between Colby and Oakley, there's a stretch of highway where the sky can turn orange without warning, and the world can fall silent in defiance of everything we think we know about how reality is supposed to behave. And sometimes, late at night when I'm planning another trip across the plains, I find myself both hoping for and dreading the possibility that I might once again find myself driving through that transformed landscape, that orange-lit world where silence reigns and the familiar becomes inexplicably alien. We bought the house in November, moving in just before the first snow of what would turn out to be a particularly harsh Minnesota winter. It was a 1950s ranch-style home in a quiet suburb of Minneapolis, the kind of solid, unpretentious place that appealed to us as first-time homeowners. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who'd lived there for 40 years before moving to a retirement community, and they'd left behind the usual remnants of a long occupancy, a few pieces of furniture we'd agreed to take, some gardening tools in the garage, and various electronic devices that were too outdated to be worth moving. Among the items they'd left was an old baby monitor sitting on a shelf in what had clearly been a child's bedroom. It was the kind with a simple base station and a portable receiver, probably from the 1990s based on the design and the fact that it used rechargeable batteries that were long dead. Sarah and I laughed about it when we found it, joking about the optimism of leaving baby gear for a couple in their 30s who had never expressed any interest in having children. We tossed the monitor into a box with other miscellaneous items that we planned to donate to charity, but somehow it never made it out of the house. The box sat in our bedroom closet for weeks, and eventually we forgot about its contents entirely. Life got busy with the process of settling into a new home, new jobs, and the social dynamics of a new neighborhood. It was sometime in January when we first heard the voice. I was working late in my home office, catching up on some freelance projects, when I heard what sounded like a child talking somewhere in the house. It was faint and indistinct, just murmured conversation that seemed to be coming from the directions of our bedroom. I assumed Sarah was watching television or talking on the phone, so I didn't investigate immediately. But when Sarah came into my office a few minutes later to say goodnight, I realized she'd been in the kitchen for the past hour, nowhere near our bedroom. When I mentioned hearing voices, she looked puzzled and said she hadn't heard anything unusual. We walked through the house together, checking each room for any source of the voices I'd heard. All the televisions were off, no radios were playing, and our neighbors' houses were too far away for us to hear conversations through the walls. Eventually, we decided I'd probably heard something from outside, maybe people walking by on the sidewalk or the sound carrying strangely through the winter air. 3 nights later, Sarah woke me up around 2 a.m., shaking my shoulder gently but insistently. She whispered. I lay still and listened. From somewhere in the house came the soft sound of a child's voice, speaking in the kind of sing-song rhythm that children use when they're playing alone or talking to themselves. The words weren't clear, but the tone was unmistakably that of a young child, maybe 3 or 4 years old. We got up and followed the sound through the house, and it led us to our bedroom closet. The voice was definitely coming from inside the closet, from the direction of the box we'd never gotten around to donating. When I opened the closet door and moved some clothes aside, the talking stopped immediately. I pulled out the box and found the old baby monitor. The receiver was sitting on top, and its power light was glowing green despite the fact that we'd never plugged it in or charged the supposedly dead batteries. When I picked up the receiver, it was warm to the touch, as if it had been operating for hours. That's impossible, Sarah said, examining the device. I checked the base station, which we found still wrapped in the original packaging at the bottom of the box. It wasn't plugged into anything, had no batteries installed, and showed no signs of having been activated. Yet somehow, the receiver had been operating and picking up transmissions from somewhere. We spent the next hour trying to figure out how the monitor could have been working. I tested various combinations of settings and frequencies, thinking maybe it was picking up signals from baby monitors in neighboring houses. But the houses in our neighborhood were too far apart for that kind of interference, and when I scanned through all the available channels, I found only static. Sarah suggested we just get rid of the monitor, donate it along with the other items we'd been meaning to clear out. But I was genuinely curious about what we'd heard and how a supposedly non-functional device had been producing clear audio signals. I convinced her to let me keep it for a few days while I researched baby monitor frequencies and potential sources of interference. I set up the receiver on my desk in the home office, positioning it where I could monitor it while I worked. For 2 days, it remained silent, just a plastic device with a glowing power light, showing no signs of the mysterious transmissions we'd heard earlier. On the 3rd night, the voice came back. I was reading in bed around 11 p.m. when I heard the familiar sound of a child talking from the direction of my office. This time, I was ready. I grabbed a digital recorder and hurried to the desk where I'd left the baby monitor receiver. The child's voice was clear and distinct, coming through the monitor's speaker with the kind of clarity that suggested the transmission source was very close by. But what I heard made my hands shake as I held the recorder. Mommy said not to go outside when it's dark, the voice said in the matter-of-fact tone that children use when reciting rules they've been taught. But I can see the lights in the backyard. I looked out my office window toward our backyard, but it was dark except for the occasional streetlight glow filtering through bare winter trees. There were no lights moving around, no signs of anything that a child might find interesting enough to watch. The voice continued. Daddy is sleeping in the big chair again. He always sleeps there now. I recorded nearly 10 minutes of similar observations, a child's commentary on what appeared to be their daily life, delivered in the kind of stream of consciousness way that young children talk when they're processing their experiences out loud. The child described family routines, discussed toys and games, and occasionally asked questions as if they were talking to an adult who was present but whose responses weren't picked up by the monitor. When the transmission finally ended, I played back my recording for Sarah. The quality was clear enough that we could make out every word, and the voice was definitely that of a young child, probably a girl, based on the pitch and intonation. Sarah asked. I'd been wondering the same thing. We knew most of our immediate neighbors, and none of them had children young enough to match the voice we were hearing. The houses on either side of us were occupied by couples in their 60s, and the family across the street had teenagers, not preschoolers. Over the following weeks, the transmissions became more frequent and more detailed. Almost every night, we'd hear the child's voice coming through the baby monitor, describing activities and interactions that painted a picture of a family life that seemed both normal and somehow troubled. The child often mentioned parents who seemed to be having difficulties, a father who slept in chairs instead of beds, a mother who cried when she thought no one was looking, arguments that happened after bedtime when the child was supposed to be asleep. The observations were delivered without judgment or apparent understanding of their significance, just a child's honest reporting of the adult world they were witnessing. What made these transmissions particularly unsettling was their consistency. The child described the same house layout that matched our own home, mentioned looking out windows that corresponded to the windows in our house, and referred to rooms and features that suggested they were living in the same physical space we occupied. But the family life being described was clearly different from our own. The child talked about furniture we didn't have, mentioned family pets we'd never owned, and described daily routines that didn't match anything Sarah and I had ever experienced in the house. I started researching the history of our home, thinking that maybe the transmissions were somehow connected to previous occupants. What I learned from neighbors and public records was troubling but not entirely surprising. In the late 1980s, the house had been occupied by a young family, parents in their 30s, with a 4-year-old daughter named Emma. The family had experienced a series of tragic events during their time in the house. The father had lost his job and had struggled with depression and alcohol abuse. The mother had been overwhelmed by financial stress and the responsibility of caring for both her husband and her daughter. The situation had culminated in a murder-suicide in January 1989. The father had killed his wife and daughter before taking his own life. all of them found in the house by concerned neighbors who hadn't seen the family for several days. The elderly couple we'd bought the house from had purchased it from the bank a year after the tragedy, living there peacefully for 4 decades without ever reporting any unusual experiences. But they'd kept the child's bedroom largely unchanged, maintaining it as a guest room but preserving many of the original features that had been there when Emma lived in the house. I realized that the voice coming through the baby monitor was describing the final weeks of Emma's life, transmitting across more than 30 years to document the decline of a family that had ended in tragedy. The observations about her father sleeping in chairs, her mother crying, the arguments after bedtime, all of it was the innocent perspective of a child who was witnessing the disintegration of her world without understanding what it meant. We stopped listening to the monitor after that, packing it away in the garage where we couldn't hear its nightly transmissions. But sometimes, late at night when the house is particularly quiet, I can still hear the faint sound of a child's voice coming from somewhere in the walls, still describing the lights in the backyard, still asking questions that will never be answered, still documenting a family life that ended decades ago, but somehow continues to broadcast its final moments to anyone willing to listen. The baby monitor is still in our garage, probably still receiving transmissions from a time when Emma was alive and unaware that her observations were being recorded for posterity. We don't have a baby, but we live in a house where a child's voice still echoes through electronic devices, still trying to make sense of a world that was falling apart around her, still broadcasting her innocence into a future where her story serves as a reminder that some tragedies leave echoes that persist long after the original sounds have faded away. I was riding the late bus home from my evening shift at the hospital when an elderly woman sitting across the aisle handed me a folded piece of paper. She didn't say anything, just leaned over, placed it in my hand, and gave me a small nod before returning to look out the window. I'd noticed her when I got on, probably in her 70s, wearing a faded green coat and carrying a canvas bag that looked like it had seen decades of use. The bus was nearly empty, just the two of us, and maybe 3 other passengers scattered throughout the seats. It was the kind of quiet Tuesday night ride where people keep to themselves, so her gesture was unexpected but not alarming. I assumed she was handing me a piece of litter or maybe a religious pamphlet, the kind of thing that sometimes gets passed around on public transit. When I unfolded the paper, I found a pencil drawing of a house, not just any house, my house. The sketch was remarkably detailed and accurate, showing the front porch with its distinctive crooked railing, the oak tree with the low-hanging branch that scrapes against the roof, even the specific pattern of cracks in the front walkway that I'd been meaning to repair for months. I looked up at the woman, but she was still gazing out the window, apparently lost in thought or deliberately avoiding eye contact. I wanted to ask her about the drawing, how she knew where I lived, why she'd drawn my house, whether this was some kind of mistake. But something about her posture suggested she didn't want to be approached. The drawing was done with careful attention to architectural details that would only be visible to someone who had spent considerable time observing the property. The proportions were correct, the windows were positioned accurately, and even small features like the loose shutter on the second floor and the garden gate that hangs slightly askew were depicted with precision. What made the drawing particularly unsettling was that it showed things I was certain couldn't be seen from the street. The back deck was visible in the sketch, along with the small shed in the rear yard and the specific arrangement of flower beds that my neighbor had planted along our shared fence line. These features were blocked from public view by the house itself and by privacy fencing. I studied the woman more carefully, trying to determine if I recognized her from my neighborhood or if there was any chance we'd met before. But she was completely unfamiliar, and I was certain I'd never seen her in my area. Our neighborhood was small enough that I knew most of the residents by sight, especially someone of her age who would stand out during regular walking hours. The bus reached my stop, and I had to decide whether to get off or stay on to continue the conversation. As I stood up, the woman finally looked directly at me and spoke for the first time. "Be careful with the basement stairs," she said quietly. "The third step from the bottom is loose." Then she returned to looking out the window, clearly indicating that the conversation was over. I got off the bus with the drawing in my hand, watching through the window as it pulled away. The woman didn't look back. When I got home, I immediately checked the basement stairs, something I hadn't thought to examine in the 6 months since I'd moved into the house. The third step from the bottom was indeed loose, wobbling noticeably when I tested it with my weight. It wasn't dangerous yet, but it was definitely something that needed to be repaired before it became a safety hazard. I spent the rest of the evening examining the drawing more closely and trying to understand how a stranger could have acquired such detailed knowledge of my property. The sketch included interior details that were visible through windows, suggesting the artist had spent considerable time observing the house from multiple angles. The level of detail was so accurate that I began to wonder if the woman was connected to the previous owner, perhaps a relative or friend who was familiar with the property from before I'd purchased it. But the drawing included recent changes I'd made: a new mailbox, different porch furniture, garden modifications that wouldn't have been known to someone whose knowledge was limited to the house's previous configuration. I asked my neighbors if they recognized the woman from my description, but no one had seen anyone matching her appearance in the area. I also checked with the bus company to see if they had any information about regular passengers who might ride that route, but they couldn't provide details about individual riders. Over the following weeks, I found myself paying closer attention to people on the bus and in my neighborhood, hoping to encounter the woman again so I could ask her about the drawing and her knowledge of my house. But I never saw her again, despite taking the same bus route every weeknight for months afterward. The drawing remains on my kitchen table, a reminder that someone has been observing my home with remarkable attention to detail. Every time I look at it, I notice new elements that demonstrate how thoroughly the artist had studied the property. Shadows that indicate the time of day when observations were made, seasonal details that show when the sketches were done, even small maintenance issues that I'd been planning to address. What bothers me most is not knowing why someone would create such a detailed record of my house, or how they acquired the knowledge necessary to draw it so accurately. The warning about the basement stairs suggests that the woman was genuinely concerned about my safety, but her method of communication was so indirect and mysterious that it raised more questions than it answered. I've become more conscious of my home's visibility from various angles, wondering how much of my daily routine might be observable to someone who was paying careful attention. The drawing serves as a reminder that privacy is more limited than we assume, and that people can acquire detailed knowledge about our lives through patient observation that we're not aware is occurring. Sometimes I wonder if the woman was trying to tell me something more than just a warning about loose stairs, perhaps communicating that my house has been under observation for reasons I don't understand. The drawing might be evidence of surveillance rather than casual interest, a way of letting me know that someone has been watching while maintaining the ambiguity necessary to avoid direct confrontation or explanation. The stranger on the bus gave me a gift that was both helpful and deeply unsettling, a demonstration of knowledge that she shouldn't have possessed, and a warning delivered through means that prevented any follow-up questions or expressions of gratitude. The drawing remains the only evidence that the encounter actually happened, a remarkably accurate sketch that documents my home in ways that suggest the artist knows far more about my daily life than any stranger should.